The courtroom buzzed with the usual tension of a high-profile trial. Lawyers huddled in whispered conversations, preparing their next move. The defendant, a powerful business tycoon with connections in both politics and organized crime, sat calmly in the dock, his cold eyes never leaving the judge. It was a case that had gripped the nation. Everyone knew the stakes were high. If the defendant was found guilty, it would send shockwaves through the corridors of power. But something in the air shifted when the door swung open. Clint Eastwood, one of the most iconic figures in American cinema, stood in the doorway. He wasn't there to star in a film or to offer a dramatic entrance for the cameras. No, this was something far more unexpected. The room went silent, and for a split second, no one knew how to react. The defendant's lawyers stifled a chuckle, thinking maybe it was a prank. It wasn't unusual for celebrities to make appearances at public trials, though rarely for anything other than a press photo. But this wasn't just any actor. Clint Eastwood. The Clint Eastwood. The man who had become a living legend through his roles in westerns and gritty action films, now standing in a courtroom, of all places. Was he here for a cameo? Or had something much bigger brought him into the fray? A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience, and a few of the jurors even leaned forward, their curiosity piqued. The judge, a middle-aged man with a stern face and little patience for distractions, looked up from the case files and let out a small laugh. He raised an eyebrow, then looked down at his notes, clearly amused by the unexpected visitor. Well, Mr. Eastwood," the judge said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I didn't realize Hollywood had a special seat reserved in my courtroom. What brings you here today? To give us a little Western flair?" The chuckles echoed across the room, but Clint didn't flinch. He walked in slowly, his expression unreadable. His weathered face, still carrying the rugged charisma of his younger years, remained stoic. The man who had spent decades facing down villains on screen now faced a different kind of adversary. And in that moment, no one knew just how far this would go. Clint made his way to the witness stand and nodded to the bailiff, who seemed too stunned to even speak. As he stood there, waiting for the proceedings to continue, the judge continued to smirk. He wasn't impressed. Celebrities had a way of turning up uninvited, after all. It was probably just a bit of showmanship to keep the trial in the media spotlight. But then, Clint Eastwood did something that made the judge's smile disappear. From beneath his jacket, Clint pulled out a badge. A shiny, official-looking badge. It wasn't a Hollywood prop. The courtroom froze. The air seemed to thicken. The judge's face drained of color, his mocking grin fading into something far more serious. Clint slowly turned the badge so everyone could see. A large silver seal glinted in the light. U.S. Secret Service. The words were printed boldly across the top. The judge blinked twice. His mouth went dry. The laughter from earlier died instantly. The defendant's lawyer stopped mid-sentence. The rest of the courtroom stood in stunned silence. The kind of silence that only comes when everything you thought you knew is turned upside down. Clint Eastwood wasn't here for the cameras, and he wasn't here for show. He was here as a government agent. A former Secret Service agent, to be precise. The courtroom wasn't filled with spectators anymore. It was filled with something far more intense. Fear. Uncertainty. And for a brief moment, even the powerful tycoon in the dock seemed rattled. The judge, now visibly sweating, adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Eastwood, if you're here on official business, perhaps you should." Clint held up a hand, his voice low and commanding. "I'm here because this case is about more than just criminal activity. It's about national security." His gaze swept over the room, landing on the judge, then the defendant. "I'm here to make sure the truth gets told." The silence that followed Clint's revelation was unbearable. The courtroom, usually a place of cold professionalism and legal jargon, now felt like a pressure cooker, the walls seeming to close in on everyone present. The judge, still caught in his surprise, cleared his throat nervously, trying to regain some sense of control over the proceedings. "Mr. Eastwood," the judge said slowly, his voice now much softer, almost respectful. "This is unexpected, to say the least, but we are in the middle of a trial. If you have information relevant to the case, then please." Clint didn't let him finish. With a deliberate slowness, Clint turned his gaze toward the defendant, who had yet to say a word since the badge was revealed. His lawyer's face was a mask of confusion and concern, but the defendant himself, a man who had lived his entire life in the shadows of power, suddenly looked very small. Clint's voice cut through the tension like a blade. This trial isn't just about fraud or bribery, Your Honor. It's about something much bigger. The people in this room don't even know the half of it. The stakes? Well, they're a hell of a lot higher than anyone realizes. The judge blinked at Clint. And what exactly does that mean, Mr. Eastwood? Clint didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step closer to the witness stand, his presence almost magnetic, the weight of his past life as an action star and his unflinching stare commanding the room's attention. He was still Clint Eastwood, the tough-as-nails persona everyone knew. But now there was something even more intense about him. The secret life he had led in the shadows was now crashing into the spotlight. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Clint to continue. I'm here because this isn't just a criminal case. This is a threat to the very heart of this country, Clint said, his eyes narrowing. And if we don't act fast, we could all be in serious trouble. A murmur spread across the courtroom. The defendant's lawyer, sensing that his client's case had taken a drastic turn, stood up abruptly. Your Honor, I request that we suspend these proceedings until we can verify Mr. Eastwood's, credentials. Clint's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he just glanced at the judge, his expression unreadable. Verify? You'd better hope you can verify. Because if you can't, it's not just your client who's in trouble, it's every single person in this room. The judge seemed to finally realize the magnitude of the situation. He hesitated, then nodded. Very well. Mr. Eastwood, you'll remain on the stand for the duration of these proceedings. But I'm not tolerating any disruptions. Wouldn't dream of it, Clint replied dryly, and with that, the courtroom resumed its tense, uneasy silence. As Clint took his seat, the air felt thick with unspoken questions. No one in the room knew what to make of this turn of events. Was Clint really involved with the U.S. Secret Service? Or was this some kind of stunt to derail the trial? But Clint had no time to wonder about that. He wasn't here for theatrics. He was here to do a job. The case had been spiraling out of control before he even stepped foot into the courtroom. The defendant, Paul Mitchell, had been accused of running an international money laundering operation, funneling millions through shell companies and black market deals. On the surface, it seemed like a straightforward case of corporate corruption. But Clint knew better. His experience with the Secret Service had taught him that appearances were often deceiving. What people thought was simple criminal activity could easily be a smokescreen for something far more insidious. The people involved in this case weren't just criminals, they were dangerous, and the stakes were much higher than anyone in this courtroom realized. Clint hadn't always been a government agent. In fact, it was hard to believe that Clint Eastwood, the man known for his roles as a tough, no-nonsense cowboy or a gritty cop, had ever been anything other than a star. But his fame, while a blessing, had also made him a prime target. Over the years, his role in Hollywood had attracted the attention of the right people in government. They knew he had the perfect blend of skill, intellect, and a unique understanding of the human condition that made him ideal for something far more important than acting. In the early 90s, Clint was approached by a government contact with an offer he couldn't refuse. It was a decision that changed the course of his life forever. He began working as an undercover agent for the U.S. Secret Service, focusing on high-profile cases involving national security and international crime syndicates. His role was to infiltrate organizations, gather intel, and help neutralize threats before they could escalate. It was dangerous, covert work, but Clint thrived in it. He lived a double life, keeping his identity hidden from the public while using his celebrity status as cover. No one suspected that the man they saw on the big screen had such a vital role in protecting the country. But now, that life had come crashing into the courtroom. Clint knew the trial involving Paul Mitchell wasn't just about financial crimes. It was part of a much larger conspiracy. A conspiracy that went all the way to the top. Back in the courtroom, as Clint observed the proceedings, he couldn't help but think about the magnitude of what was at stake. Mitchell wasn't just a wealthy businessman. He was a key player in a vast network of criminals, politicians, and corrupt officials. A network that could bring the entire country to its knees if left unchecked. Clint's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the judge banging his gavel, signaling the trial to continue. The defense attorney, clearly rattled, tried to get the case back on track. "Your Honor," the defense lawyer stammered, "I still request that we halt these proceedings until we can. You'll get your chance to question Mr. Eastwood," the judge snapped, now visibly flustered. "But let's continue the trial, shall we?" Clint's gaze never wavered. He was used to handling pressure. He'd spent years working in environments where the difference between life and death was decided in seconds. This trial, with its intricate webs of deceit, was child's play compared to the real dangers he had faced in his career. But he was here for a reason, and he wasn't going to let anything, or anyone, derail his mission. As the defense attorney reluctantly sat down, Clint prepared for the questions that would come next. He knew that the real test was just beginning. There was a long road ahead, filled with lies, betrayals, and revelations that no one could have predicted. But Clint Eastwood wasn't just an actor. He was here to do what he had always done: protect the people who couldn't protect themselves. The courtroom was a battlefield of tension. Clint Eastwood had turned it into something much bigger than a simple trial. It had become a stage for a battle of wits, one that nobody in the room was quite prepared for. The defense attorney, visibly rattled after Clint's bombshell revelation, was no longer concerned with the case itself. Now, he had only one thing on his mind: how to discredit Clint Eastwood, the U.S. Secret Service agent in the room, without digging too deep into dangerous territory. But Clint wasn't there to play games. He was here for something much more important. "Mr. Eastwood," the defense lawyer began, his voice shaky but trying to sound composed, "if you're truly here as a representative of the Secret Service, I assume you've been briefed on the proceedings. Do you have any direct evidence that connects my client, Mr. Mitchell, to the charges?" The judge gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, signaling that it was now Clint's turn to speak. But Clint didn't jump into the fray immediately. He knew better than to reveal too much, too soon. He had to tread carefully. Clint stood up from the witness stand with a slow, deliberate movement, his boots scraping lightly against the polished floor. His weathered face betrayed little emotion, but there was an undeniable intensity in his eyes as he glanced around the room, gauging every person in it. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he would finish it if it came to that. "I don't have direct evidence in the way you're asking," Clint said calmly, his voice low but commanding. "But I have something more important, the truth. And that truth is, your client, Mr. Mitchell, is only the tip of the iceberg." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The defendant's lawyer leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. "The tip of the iceberg?" he repeated with a scoff, clearly not taking Clint seriously. "Do you mean to imply that Mr. Mitchell is connected to something bigger than what's on the table here?" Clint's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "Exactly. This trial is about money laundering, yes. But it's also about corruption at the highest levels. You're not just defending a criminal, you're defending an entire network." The room went still again. The tension was suffocating. Clint could see it in the judge's eyes. He was beginning to realize the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a courtroom drama. This was something much bigger. Something that could potentially unravel the very fabric of the American political system. The defense attorney opened his mouth to speak again, but Clint cut him off with a raised hand. "You don't want to do this," Clint said quietly, his gaze never leaving the lawyer's. "You don't want to go down this road, because if you do, it'll be more than your career at risk. It'll be your freedom." The defense attorney froze. He had heard rumors. Everyone had. There were whispers about Clint Eastwood's past involvement with national security, but no one dared to question it, at least not openly. Now, however, the implications of his words were sinking in. The judge, feeling the growing sense of unease, tried to regain control of the courtroom. "Mr. Eastwood, I ask you to keep your statements relevant to the case at hand. We're here to discuss the charges against Mr. Mitchell, not to entertain wild theories." Clint nodded slowly, acknowledging the judge's request but not backing down. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this isn't a theory. It's a reality you're not ready to face yet." He turned toward Mitchell. "Paul Mitchell isn't the mastermind here. He's just the front man. There are people much higher up pulling the strings, and I've been tracking them for months. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. This wasn't just about money laundering anymore. This was about something far more dangerous, something that could potentially bring down powerful figures. The defendant, who had been stone-faced for most of the trial, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His eyes darted nervously around the room, avoiding Clint's gaze. The first cracks in his composure were beginning to show. He knew Clint wasn't bluffing. The judge, though clearly shaken, tried to maintain control. "Mr. Eastwood," he said again, his voice firm, "I'm giving you one chance to present concrete evidence. Otherwise, we'll have to proceed with the case as it stands." Clint's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. He knew that evidence would come in time, but it wouldn't come in the form of documents or flashy testimonies. The evidence he had was embedded in the secrets these people were desperate to keep hidden. Clint's mind briefly drifted back to the months of covert work he had put in before stepping into this courtroom. It wasn't his first time facing off against powerful enemies. In fact, Clint had spent the better part of his life confronting those who hid in the shadows, people who used their wealth and influence to manipulate the system. But this was different. It started when Clint had received an anonymous tip about a money laundering operation that went far beyond the usual scope. The players involved were far too influential, their connections too deep. Every lead he followed pointed to Paul Mitchell's network, but it was clear from the start that Mitchell wasn't the mastermind. He was simply a cog in a much larger machine. For weeks, Clint had tracked Mitchell's moves, gaining intel from every corner of the globe. He'd infiltrated meetings, spoken to informants, and pieced together a web of deception that spanned continents. And through it all, Clint had found one undeniable truth. At the center of the operation was someone with direct ties to the highest echelons of power in Washington. But even Clint's connections could only get him so far. As the trail grew colder, Clint realized he needed more. He needed leverage. He needed someone from the inside who could confirm what he already suspected. And that was when he found it. A source inside Mitchell's organization had come forward. But what they knew was far worse than Clint had imagined. This wasn't just about corruption. It was about a planned assault on national security. The operation Mitchell was running had ties to international terrorism, political destabilization, and even covert operations designed to weaken the country from within. Clint had reported everything back to his superiors, but he knew that some of the details had to be kept hidden. Not everyone in the government could be trusted. Some of the people Clint worked with were just as deep in the conspiracy as Mitchell. Back in the courtroom, Clint's mind snapped back to the present. He couldn't give away too much, not yet. But the clock was ticking, and the stakes were getting higher by the minute. He needed to stay one step ahead of everyone else in the room. That meant he had to play the game, even if it wasn't the game he wanted to play. "You want proof?" Clint said suddenly, turning his gaze back to the judge. "I'll give it to you. But not here, not now. I'll give it to you when the time is right." The judge narrowed his eyes, clearly frustrated. "When is the time right, Mr. Eastwood?" Clint paused, then leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "When you've lost control. When the walls start closing in and you realize that everything you thought you knew about this case is wrong." The courtroom fell silent once again. The players were now in motion. The game had begun. The tension in the courtroom was now palpable. Clint Eastwood had drawn the proverbial line in the sand, and there was no turning back. He had just hinted at the tip of a massive conspiracy, and the entire room was hanging on his every word. For a moment, it seemed as if the air had thickened, the usual legal jargon and procedural motions now drowned out by the weight of Clint's revelations. The judge, clearly struggling to regain control, slammed his gavel once again, though it didn't quite have the same commanding effect as before. "Mr. Eastwood," the judge said, trying to sound authoritative but clearly unsettled, "I'll remind you that this is a courtroom, not a Hollywood set. You are here to provide testimony, not to hold a press conference. If you have evidence, present it, or we will move on." Clint's gaze didn't waver from the judge, his face as unreadable as stone. "I have nothing to prove right now, Your Honor," Clint said, his voice steady and calm. "But you will. Soon enough." The judge's knuckles turned white on the gavel, but before he could respond, The courtroom door creaked open with a low groan. A new figure had entered. Everyone turned, and for a split second, it felt like the room shifted again. This wasn't just another lawyer, or a witness, or even an investigator. It was someone with a quiet authority that was almost palpable. She was tall, sharp-featured, and dressed in a sleek black suit. Her dark eyes scanned the room with precision, immediately making her presence known. The woman stood still for a moment, as if assessing the situation with military efficiency. The only sound in the room was the click of her high heels as she moved forward, her gaze settling briefly on Clint before fixing on the judge. "Apologies for my tardiness, Your Honor," she said coolly, her voice soft but unwavering. "I am Special Agent Rachel Hayes with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I've been assigned to this case." The words FBI seemed to hang in the air like a warning shot. Everyone in the courtroom froze for a moment, the new agent's mere presence enough to shift the energy in the room. Clint raised an eyebrow. He knew this woman, not personally, but from his time working covertly with various agencies, he had crossed paths with her before. Rachel Hayes was someone who didn't speak much, but when she did, people listened. Her reputation was as sharp as the suit she wore. The judge blinked, clearly taken aback. "Special Agent Hayes, are you here to assist Mr. Eastwood with his testimony?" "No, Your Honor," Hayes replied, her gaze flickering back to Clint, then focusing squarely on the judge. "I'm here because we've been monitoring this case for quite some time. There are things happening behind the scenes that require my attention. The investigation into Mr. Mitchell goes deeper than you're aware. My agency was just about to take over certain aspects of the case when Mr. Eastwood so kindly revealed himself." The judge looked from Clint to Hayes, and then back to Clint, his earlier arrogance starting to fade. "What exactly are you implying, Agent Hayes? That this case is beyond my jurisdiction?" Agent Hayes paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "Not beyond your jurisdiction, Your Honor. Just bigger than you think." Clint's eyes narrowed, watching the exchange unfold. So, the FBI was finally getting involved. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when the full scale of the conspiracy would finally be recognized. He had his doubts about the FBI's involvement, but he wasn't in a position to question it yet. He had his own job to do. The defense attorney, visibly uncomfortable with this new development, took a moment to compose himself. "Your Honor," he said, his voice shaking just slightly, "I believe that Agent Hayes should explain her role in this case before we proceed. This is highly irregular." "Agreed," the judge replied, eyeing the two government agents with suspicion. "Agent Hayes, if you're here to assist Mr. Eastwood, then it would only be proper for you to clarify the nature of your involvement." Clint stepped forward before Agent Hayes could speak, his voice cutting through the rising tension. "This isn't about assistance," Clint said. "I'm here to help you understand the full scope of the situation, but Agent Hayes is here because she's part of something much bigger. This case isn't just about Mitchell's little operation. It's about a much larger network that involves not just corrupt businessmen, but government officials, politicians, and foreign agents." Hayes glanced at Clint for a moment, almost approvingly. She could see that he wasn't just making wild accusations, he was prepared to back them up. She had already known this, of course. It was why she had been brought in. But for the others in the courtroom, this was new information. "You have no idea how deep this runs," Clint continued, his voice now filled with quiet intensity. "People who are supposed to be working for this country are actively working against it. And Mitchell? He's the one they'll sacrifice. The rest of them? They're already planning their escape." Agent Hayes stepped forward then, cutting Clint off. "He's right," she said, her voice smooth and unwavering. "What Mr. Eastwood isn't telling you is that this isn't just about money laundering or corporate corruption. This case is tied to national security, and if we don't move fast, we'll be too late." The room was quiet again, everyone trying to process the weight of what had just been said. The judge's gavel was left untouched on the desk for a moment, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he tried to regain control. "Are you saying that this trial is somehow a distraction?" the judge asked, his voice incredulous. "Not a distraction," Clint corrected. "This trial is part of the plan. A carefully crafted smokescreen. Mitchell's trial will take all the attention. while the real moves are being made in the background. Agent Hayes looked at Clint, a slight nod of agreement. We've been watching this case for months. Mitchell is not the target. He's expendable. But the real players behind this? They're much harder to track. There was a pause as the weight of their words began to sink in. Everyone was still trying to make sense of what had just happened. The courtroom had now become a battlefield for information, and nobody knew who they could trust. Clint's mind drifted again, as it had done so many times before, back to the weeks of surveillance. It wasn't just Mitchell's company that had drawn his attention. It was the people who worked with him. The secret meetings, the foreign agents slipping through the cracks, and the carefully hidden transactions that had been funneled through layers of fake companies and offshore accounts. It wasn't just about money. It was about power. And Clint knew that power wasn't just in the hands of criminals. It was in the hands of people who were supposed to protect the country. People in the government, in the military, in intelligence agencies, who had been compromised. And now, Clint was trying to take them down, piece by piece, while staying one step ahead of the very people who were hunting him. Back in the courtroom, the tension was unbearable. The judge stood up, pacing slowly, his mind racing as he processed what had just been revealed. It was clear that this trial had become something far more complicated than he had ever anticipated. "I need time to think," the judge muttered. "We need to pause these proceedings." "Your Honor," Clint spoke up, his voice firm, "there's no time to waste. Every second you hesitate is another second that allows the people behind Mitchell to get closer to their goal." The judge stopped pacing and turned to Clint. "And what is that goal, Mr. Eastwood?" Clint looked the judge straight in the eye. "The goal is to break the country from within, and we're about to find out just how close they are to succeeding." The judge's decision to pause the trial hung heavily in the air, like a sword suspended over everyone's heads. His gavel had come down with a sharp, final thud, signaling a brief recess. But there was no comfort in the brief respite. No one in the courtroom felt at ease. The revelation of a national security crisis was no small matter, and everyone now understood that things were about to escalate far beyond a simple money laundering case. Clint Eastwood sat back in his chair, folding his arms, eyes scanning the room. Agent Rachel Hayes had taken a seat next to him, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed on the judge as he stepped off the bench to confer with his staff. She didn't look at Clint, but he knew she was thinking the same thing he was. Time is running out. In the back of the courtroom, the defense attorney was having a heated conversation with his client, Paul Mitchell. The defense was scrambling to manage the fallout, trying to piece together an argument that could discredit everything Clint and Hayes had just put on the table. But deep down, they both knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down. Mitchell, who had been sitting in silence for the majority of the proceedings, was finally showing signs of panic. His face was pale, his hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the chair. It wasn't the money he feared. It was the people who would come for him once this trial was over. He knew as well as Clint did that he was a pawn in a much larger game. Clint's phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the uneasy silence. He glanced at the screen quickly, reading the message from his contact in the Department of Justice. It was brief, cryptic. "The network is shifting. They know you're onto them. Be careful." His brow furrowed as he slipped the phone back into his pocket. Whoever had sent this message was right to be concerned. The network, the people behind this, were likely scrambling to cover their tracks, pulling strings to ensure that Clint didn't get too close to the truth. He needed to stay ahead of them. But Clint couldn't do this alone. Hayes was a critical ally in all of this, even if she didn't know the whole story. They hadn't had time to go over the full scope of the conspiracy, and Clint was still unsure how far her loyalty really extended. But there was no choice now. They were in this together, for better or worse. "Hayes," Clint muttered quietly, not turning to face her. "We need to get to Mitchell's office. Now, before they move anything." Rachel Hayes didn't hesitate. She stood up without a word and made her way toward the door, signaling for Clint to follow her. They didn't need to exchange another word. The urgency in Clint's voice had been enough. Time was running out. The courthouse loomed behind them, a tall, imposing structure that seemed to cast a shadow over everything. Outside, the city was busy, but it was the kind of city that was always on edge. Nothing was ever truly quiet. not with the kinds of people Clint was dealing with. As Clint and Hayes moved toward the sleek black car parked by the curb, Clint couldn't help but feel the weight of their position. They were being watched. He could feel it. The usual anonymity of a public street had evaporated the moment they stepped out of the courthouse. The car was unmarked, sleek, and efficient. Inside, Clint sat in the passenger seat, his fingers tapping absently on his knee as Hayes took the wheel. She was calm, focused, but Clint could sense the tension in her eyes as she navigated the traffic. "We'll get to Mitchell's office in 20 minutes, Hayes said, breaking the silence. "But you need to tell me everything you know, Eastwood. If we're going after this network, we need to be on the same page." Clint glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I'm not sure you're ready to hear it all," he replied. "This isn't just about money laundering. It's not just about Mitchell. This goes to the highest levels of power in this country, people who have already figured out how to manipulate the system." Hayes glanced at him, her hands tightening on the steering wheel. "I didn't think you were the kind of guy to hold back, Eastwood. If we're going up against these people, we need all the cards on the table. Now." Clint hesitated for a moment. It was a delicate situation. Hayes was right. They couldn't afford to hold anything back. But he also knew that once the truth was out, there would be no going back. Not for either of them. He exhaled slowly. "I'll tell you everything," he said. "But you need to understand something. This isn't just about politics. It's about control. The people behind this operation are looking to destabilize the country, create chaos, and weaken national security. They're using Mitchell as a scapegoat, but they're already planning their next move." Hayes remained silent for a moment, processing his words. "Are you saying that Mitchell's operation is just the beginning?" Clint nodded. "Exactly. They've got their fingers in everything. Corporations, politics, even the military. And it's all connected." A sharp silence followed. Hayes had been in the FBI long enough to know that what Clint was describing wasn't just a conspiracy theory. It was a carefully orchestrated plan. A plan that had been years in the making. When Hayes spoke again, her voice was steady but edged with determination. "So, what's the next step? How do we stop them?" Clint met her gaze, his eyes steely. "We find the people who are pulling the strings, and we bring them down." By the time they reached Mitchell's office, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the buildings. Clint and Hayes moved quickly, staying low and avoiding attention. They weren't sure how far ahead the people behind Mitchell's network were, but they knew they couldn't afford to waste time. Mitchell's office was a high-rise on the edge of downtown, a luxurious space with sweeping views of the city, all glass and chrome. It looked impressive from the outside, but Clint had been inside before. He knew it was a front, a place where Mitchell and his associates held their meetings and made their deals. Clint and Hayes slipped inside without incident. The receptionist at the front desk barely looked up from her screen as they moved past her, and no one seemed to notice them entering the private elevator that led to Mitchell's floor. Once they arrived, Clint didn't hesitate. He had a key card from a previous investigation, one he'd kept on hand in case he ever needed it, and they moved into the secured area without a word. The office was dark, the blinds closed to block out the fading light. But Clint didn't need to see to know what was inside. He'd been in these kinds of rooms before. "What are we looking for?" Hayes asked quietly as they moved further in, her voice hushed. Clint's eyes scanned the room. He was looking for anything that might point to the network's next move. A document, a file, an encrypted message, anything that might tell him who was involved at the highest levels. Then, his eyes landed on a large metal filing cabinet at the far end of the office. It was locked, but Clint had no doubt it contained the answers they were looking for. He walked toward it, pulling a small device from his pocket. It was a simple tool, nothing flashy, but Clint had used it countless times. Within moments, the lock clicked open. As he swung open the drawer, a thick manila folder caught his eye. It was labeled simply, Operation Blackout. Clint's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the evidence they needed. He slid the folder out and opened it carefully, scanning the contents. Inside were detailed plans, communications between government officials, military contractors, and shadowy international figures. And the most alarming part? A timeline of operations that would begin within the next 48 hours. The countdown had already started. The heavy manila folder felt like a weight in Clint's hands. He had uncovered enough secrets in his career to understand the magnitude of what he was holding. But Operation Blackout was different. It wasn't just another case of corporate corruption or a politician pocketing a bribe. This was something much more dangerous. The names and dates sprawled across the papers were like a map to a ticking bomb, and Clint could feel the seconds slipping away. Agent Rachel Hayes stood at the door, her posture tense, as if expecting someone, or something, to barge in at any moment. The quiet hum of the building's air conditioning was the only sound, a stark contrast to the high-stakes situation unfolding in the room. Clint flipped through the pages quickly, his mind racing. The plan was intricate, neatly laid out and disturbingly effective. The operation wasn't just about destabilizing the country in the long term. It was designed to create immediate chaos, throwing the nation into a crisis that would make it impossible to identify who was truly behind it. The conspiracy was even more elaborate than Clint had initially suspected. "Hayes," Clint said, his voice low but sharp with urgency. "This goes deeper than I thought. These aren't just business deals. They're a coordinated effort to disrupt our government, military, everything. This operation isn't just financial. It's political. And it's happening now." Hayes stepped forward, her eyes scanning the papers over his shoulder. "What do you mean, happening now? Are you telling me this plan is already in motion?" Clint nodded grimly. "It's happening this weekend. Operation Blackout is scheduled to kick off in 48 hours. There's a series of coordinated events set to happen at once. Military bases, government agencies, high-value targets all over the country. The goal is to sow confusion and undermine the national security apparatus." A wave of realization seemed to hit Hayes. So it's not just a financial hit job. This is about collapsing the government from within. Exactly. Clint looked up from the papers, meeting her eyes. And Mitchell is just a small part of this. They're using him as a decoy. He's the distraction. The real plan is much bigger. The people behind this operation are playing a long game, and they're too far ahead for anyone to stop them. Hayes clenched her fists, her jaw tightening. "If what you're saying is true, this could bring down the entire government. I don't need to tell you that, but we can't let it happen. We have to stop it, Hayes. We have to stop it now." They both knew they couldn't do this alone. They needed more than just the evidence in this folder. They needed leverage, and they needed help from people who had the resources to act fast. It was too big for them to handle on their own. Clint looked at Hayes again, a brief moment of uncertainty crossing his face. "We need to go to the top. We need to get this to someone who can actually make a difference, someone in a position of power who isn't already compromised." Hayes hesitated. "You want me to take this to my superiors? You're asking me to risk everything." Clint didn't flinch. "We don't have time to be cautious anymore. We're out of options. If we don't act, this is over for all of us." Hayes stood silent for a long moment, considering the weight of his words. She knew that taking this step would put her career, and possibly her life, on the line. But deep down, she also knew there was no other choice. This was bigger than any one person, bigger than any department or agency. Finally, she nodded. "All right, I'll make the call. But we're running out of time, Eastwood." Clint and Hayes moved quickly, navigating the hallways of the building with a sense of urgency that was almost palpable. They couldn't risk getting caught by Mitchell's people, and they certainly couldn't risk anyone inside the FBI knowing what they were about to do. It wasn't just the conspiracy they had to worry about. It was the people who were still playing both sides. Hayes' phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, her expression hardening as she looked at the incoming call. "This is Agent Hayes," she answered crisply, trying to mask the tension in her voice. "Hayes, we've got a situation." The voice on the other end was deep and professional. It was Director Larson, someone Hayes trusted, but someone who wasn't above playing the political game. "What's going on? I've heard rumors you're in deep with Eastwood on this Mitchell case. Is there something I need to know?" Hayes exhaled sharply. She could feel Clint's eyes on her, and she knew that the stakes were about to rise to an all-new level. "Director, I need to see you. It's urgent. This is bigger than Mitchell. We're talking national security, an operation that's been in the works for years. And it's set to launch in less than 2 days." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. I'll have someone meet you at your location. Stay low, Hayes. This could be bigger than anyone realizes. Hayes disconnected the call and pocketed her phone. We're on, she said to Clint, her voice steady but tinged with the edge of a person who knew the gravity of the situation. Director Larson is sending someone to meet us. We need to move now. Clint gave a short nod, his face unreadable. They didn't have the luxury of waiting. The next few hours could make or break everything. As Clint and Hayes made their way toward the rendezvous point, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every time he glanced behind him, he saw the shadows stretch longer, a chill crawling up his spine as the familiar feeling of being hunted took hold. Someone's tailing us, Clint murmured, not looking at Hayes but speaking to her in a quiet voice that only she could hear. Hayes' hand instinctively dropped to the sidearm she carried, but she didn't react outwardly. Do you think it's Mitchell's people, or someone else? Could be anyone, Clint said, his mind racing. The people behind this, they've got eyes everywhere. They know we're getting close. The sense of paranoia had always been a part of Clint's world, but it had become even more pronounced since he had started digging into this case. The deeper they got, the closer they came to uncovering the truth, the more dangerous it became. They made their way into a less populated area, a narrow alleyway that led to a parking garage. This wasn't the most obvious place to meet, but it was secluded enough for them to get out of sight if things went sideways. Clint's hand slid into his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing the cool metal of his own gun. He wasn't taking any chances. They were outnumbered, and whoever was following them could be part of a larger operation. As they turned the corner, Clint and Hayes froze. Standing at the far end of the alley was a tall figure, dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by the shadows. He didn't move, didn't flinch. Stay calm, Clint whispered. The figure stepped forward, and Clint's hand tightened on his weapon. But when the man spoke, his voice was familiar. Clint. Hayes. The man's voice was low, gravelly, but undeniably authoritative. I'm here to make sure you don't do something you'll regret. Clint's heart skipped a beat. He knew that voice. It was someone who had been with him in the field, someone he hadn't seen in years. Agent Reynolds? Clint asked, his voice betraying the surprise he felt. Reynolds stepped into the light, his face grim. You're going to need more than just the FBI to take this down, Eastwood. You're in too deep. The atmosphere in the alleyway was thick with tension. Clint's mind raced as he stared at Agent Reynolds. The man had always been a solid partner back in the field, trustworthy, sharp, and unflinchingly loyal. But now Clint wasn't so sure. Reynolds had disappeared years ago, swallowed up by a series of covert assignments, and Clint hadn't heard from him since. Now, he was standing in front of them in the shadows of the night, a figure who seemed to have all the answers but was offering none. Clint knew better than to trust appearances, and this was no time for nostalgia. You're in too deep, Eastwood, Reynolds repeated, stepping closer into the dim light. His voice was grave, carrying the weight of an unspoken warning. Clint didn't lower his hand from his jacket pocket, where his fingers brushed the cold metal of his gun. His instincts had saved his life more times than he could count, and tonight, he wasn't about to let sentiment cloud his judgment. We don't have time for cryptic warnings, Reynolds, Clint said flatly. Either you tell us what you know, or we're walking away and dealing with this ourselves. Reynolds met Clint's gaze. His eyes were shadowed, as though the man had seen too much. The lines on his face were deeper, and there was something in his stance, an unspoken heaviness, that hinted at a truth Clint wasn't sure he wanted to know. Yeah, Reynolds muttered. I figured you'd say that. But listen up, Eastwood. You're not the only one who's been chasing ghosts. The people behind this? They're more organized than you think. You've only scratched the surface. Clint's mind clicked into place. He could sense the shift in Reynolds' tone, the subtle urgency beneath the surface. He had no idea what this old ally was tangled up in, but whatever it was big, and Clint couldn't afford to let him walk away without getting answers. What the hell do you mean? Hayes interjected, stepping up beside Clint. Her hand was still near her sidearm, but her voice held a note of authority now. This wasn't a casual conversation anymore. You know more about Operation Blackout than we do, don't you? Spill it. Reynolds glanced over at her, his eyes sharp but weary. He didn't flinch at the demand. It's worse than you think, Agent Hayes. The operation isn't just limited to one group. It's multinational. You're talking about a network of military contractors, foreign intelligence, and key players in the government itself. There are people inside who are working both sides. You've been chasing Mitchell, but the people you're really after are untouchable. Clint exchanged a glance with Hayes, who looked more than a little shaken by Reynolds' words. Untouchable? You're telling us that we're not even close to who's really pulling the strings? Reynolds nodded, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I don't know who they are exactly, at least, not all of them, but I've seen the threads. You don't just find this kind of thing on a whim. They've been in the shadows for years, pulling levers, making moves in silence. Mitchell's operation is just a distraction, a convenient cover for what's really happening behind the scenes. Clint's mind was spinning. He had always known the people behind Operation Blackout were powerful, but this was bigger than anything he'd imagined. So, what are we supposed to do now? Hayes asked, her voice tinged with frustration. We've got a ticking clock on our hands, and every step we take just makes it look like the people we're after are already 10 steps ahead. Reynolds looked at her for a long moment before he spoke again. You're right. You won't be able to stop them by playing by the book. It's bigger than the law. The people behind this have every possible resource at their disposal. If you want to stop them, you'll need more than just good intel. You'll need to make them believe you're one of them. Clint blinked, taken aback. What the hell are you talking about? Reynolds stepped closer, his voice low. I'm talking about infiltration. You'll need to get inside their operation. You'll need to gain their trust, even if it means going against everything you believe in. Clint's pulse quickened as the weight of Reynolds' words sank in. Infiltrate. Gain their trust. It sounded like the kind of mission Clint had taken on in the past. Dangerous, risky, and impossible. But there was no other way. You want us to go undercover? Clint asked, narrowing his eyes. That's crazy. Reynolds gave a grim smile. You don't have much of a choice. You go in, you find out what you can, and you stop it from the inside. That's the only way to shut down Operation Blackout before it launches. Hayes crossed her arms. And who's going to back us up when things inevitably go south? You? Or are you just here to drop a bomb and disappear again? Reynolds didn't flinch. He had no answer for her, just a steady gaze that suggested he wasn't interested in making promises. He was, after all, a man who had already risked everything to uncover the truth, and it looked like his involvement in this case was far from over. The fewer people who know about this, the better, Reynolds said, his tone final. But I'm giving you the tools to make it happen. You'll have your access, and you'll need to act fast. This weekend is your window. Clint could see the weight of the decision in Hayes' eyes. They were facing a monumental task, one that could cost them everything. But Clint also knew that this was their best shot. They didn't have the luxury of time, and if they didn't move quickly, Operation Blackout would go live, and millions of lives would be affected. He took a deep breath and nodded. All right, we do this. But if we're going in, we need to move fast. And we need to make sure we're not being played. Reynolds looked at him, his gaze sharpening. You're going to be watched every step of the way. Trust no one. But you're right, time's running out. You've got 48 hours to make it happen. With that, Reynolds turned and disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Clint and Hayes to digest the weight of their new mission. Back in Clint's unmarked car, parked a few blocks from the alley, they started to piece together what needed to happen next. We've got no backup, Hayes said quietly, her fingers tapping nervously on the steering wheel. I don't like this. Not one bit. Clint didn't look at her, his eyes focused on the road ahead. I don't like it either, Hayes. But this is our only shot. We don't have the luxury of playing it safe. Hayes gritted her teeth. So, what's the plan? Clint paused for a moment, his mind going over the details Reynolds had shared. The operation was set to begin in less than 2 days, but they had to get in deep before then. The network had to be exposed and fast. You're going to need a cover, Clint said, his voice steady. We'll have to work with whatever's available. Fake identities, tech support, anything to make it look like we're part of the operation. And we need to stay off the radar. No phone calls, no messages, No trace. Understood. Hayes nodded. And what's your role? Clint's lips twitched in the faintest of smiles. I'll be your inside man. I've got a contact I can leverage, someone who can vouch for me. But we'll have to move quickly. Once we're in, we're on our own. Hayes didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue. All right, Eastwood. Let's do it. The quiet hum of Clint's unmarked car was almost deafening as they drove through the dimly lit streets. Time was a luxury they didn't have. Every second that passed felt like another tick closer to the inevitable chaos Operation Blackout would bring. But Clint knew they couldn't rush this. They had to be patient, strategic, and, above all, careful. One misstep could expose them and destroy everything. Hayes sat next to him, eyes focused but filled with anxiety. Clint could feel the weight of her gaze on him, the pressure of her doubt hanging in the air. She was a professional, but this was uncharted territory. Infiltration, deception. It wasn't something she'd signed up for when she joined the FBI. How are we going to even get close to them? Hayes finally asked, her voice low, as though speaking too loudly would somehow blow their cover. Reynolds didn't exactly hand us a map. Clint's fingers tightened around the steering wheel, the cold leather biting into his skin. He'd been thinking about that very question. They had no idea who was truly behind this operation. And even if they did, the layers of protection around them were deep, too deep for anyone on the outside to reach without help from someone on the inside. I've got a contact, Clint replied, his voice steady. Someone who can get us close to one of their key players. But we'll have to play it carefully. Trust no one, Hayes. Not even them. Hayes nodded, her expression hardening. Got it. So we're going to meet your contact, and then what? Pretend to be one of them? Clint exhaled slowly. Exactly. We'll use fake IDs, make sure our story checks out. Once we're inside, we play by their rules. They'll vet us, so we've got to make sure we're clean. A shiver ran down Clint's spine as he spoke. This wasn't just about uncovering a conspiracy. It was about playing a deadly game where the stakes were higher than ever. They were going to be walking among traitors, criminals, and the kind of people who wouldn't hesitate to dispose of anyone who got in their way. As Clint navigated through the streets, his mind raced through their options. Hayes was right to be wary. This wasn't a game they could afford to lose. But there was no choice. If they didn't find a way in, Operation Blackout would launch, and they would be powerless to stop it. They pulled into a parking garage, hidden in the shadows of a towering building. It was the kind of place that would blend in with 100 other, nondescript structures in the city. It had been Clint's idea. Low profile, untraceable, perfect for a clandestine meeting. Clint killed the engine and turned to Hayes, his face grave. This contact of mine, he's not someone you'll like. He's ex-military, and he's been in some pretty questionable circles. But he's got connections. He's the only person who can help us get the information we need. Hayes' expression was unreadable, but Clint could tell she wasn't happy with the arrangement. I don't like the sound of this, Eastwood. You're telling me we're going to work with someone like that? Clint met her gaze, his eyes hard. We don't have time to play by the rules anymore. We have to trust him. If we don't, we might as well walk away from this whole thing right now. Reluctantly, Hayes nodded. All right, let's do it. But I'm not making any promises. Clint led the way as they exited the car and walked through the deserted parking garage. The only sounds were the echoes of their footsteps, their breath heavy in the cool night air. They reached a door near the far corner, a small, unmarked entrance. Clint knocked twice, 2 quick taps followed by a long pause. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a man with a scruffy beard and piercing blue eyes. He was wearing a leather jacket that looked like it had seen better days, his expression unreadable as he regarded Clint and Hayes. "You're late," the man said gruffly, stepping aside to let them in. Clint didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You've got what we need?" The man, known only as Cole, narrowed his eyes. "You sure you want to do this? This isn't the kind of business that goes away quietly, Eastwood. You're asking me to put myself in a position where people will come looking for me." Clint leaned forward, his tone icy. "I don't care about your problems, Cole. I care about stopping Operation Blackout. You'll help us, or I'll make sure you're not a problem anymore. Got it?" Cole studied Clint for a long moment, his eyes calculating. Finally, he nodded, his lips curling into a faint smirk. Got it. But don't think I'm doing this out of the goodness of my heart. You've got something I want too. Clint stiffened. And what's that? The right to disappear once this is over, Cole said, his voice cool. I've been running my own little game for too long. If you want my help, you'll make sure I'm out of this mess when it's done. No questions asked. You get what you want, and I get the hell out of here. Clint didn't hesitate. You've got your deal. Now, let's talk about how we can get close to Operation Blackout. Cole's expression shifted, a calculating glint in his eyes. All right, here's what I know. The people behind this operation, they don't make mistakes. They've got layers of protection, layers of security. You can't just waltz in there. But you've got a shot. One of their mid-level guys is looking for new recruits. Someone with your skill set. He's a big player in this whole thing. If you can get him to vouch for you, you'll be in. Clint raised an eyebrow. And how do we get him to trust us? Cole grinned. You play the game. Make them think you're one of them. Do the job they want, and they'll let you get close. It's all about trust, Eastwood. And if you can get past the first layer, you'll have your shot. Hayes glanced at Clint. You're telling us to infiltrate a criminal network by pretending to be one of them? Exactly, Cole replied. It's the only way. The clock's ticking, and you don't have time for mistakes. But if you can get in with this guy, you'll be in the game. Clint took a deep breath, the weight of their mission pressing down on him. He knew this was a dangerous road, but it was the only one left. We'll do it, Clint said, his voice steady. But you'd better keep your end of the deal, Cole. We need this to work. The next morning, Clint and Hayes were back at their makeshift base, putting together their cover story. They had a handful of fake identities, thanks to Cole's connections, and a plan that felt as risky as it did necessary. They'd be posing as mercenaries, hired guns looking for a high-paying gig with a network that thrived on secrecy and chaos. Clint adjusted his tie in the mirror, his eyes dark with focus. We're about to dive headfirst into the lion's den. Stay alert, Hayes. One wrong move, and it's over. Hayes nodded, her face steely with determination. I'm ready. Let's get this over with. As they left the base and headed toward their first meeting with the mid-level operative, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. But there was no turning back now. They had to play the part, get close, and find a way to shut down Operation Blackout before the clock ran out. The air felt thicker than usual as Clint and Hayes walked through the streets toward their meeting point. Every corner seemed to hide another layer of danger, each step bringing them closer to the heart of Operation Blackout. They were about to enter the belly of the beast, and Clint knew they couldn't afford to fail. The address Cole had given them led them to a dingy warehouse tucked away in the industrial part of town, a place where the hum of machines drowned out the sound of anything that mattered. It wasn't a place you'd expect to find the elite of a covert operation, but Clint knew better. The real players didn't stay in the spotlight. They worked in shadows, hiding in plain sight. Clint glanced over at Hayes as they approached the warehouse. She looked tense, her hand hovering near her gun. They hadn't spoken much since leaving Cole's hideout, both of them lost in their own thoughts. But now, as the warehouse loomed ahead, Clint could sense the anxiety creeping in. You ready for this? Clint asked, his voice quiet but steady. Hayes nodded. I don't think we have a choice anymore. Either we go through with it, or we let the operation run its course. We stop it now, or we lose everything. Clint felt the weight of her words. They weren't just infiltrating a network. They were walking into a trap, one that could end their careers, their lives, and the lives of countless innocent people. The thought of what was at stake made his stomach twist, but he pushed it down. He couldn't afford to let fear control him now. Let's stick to the plan. Remember, we're mercenaries. No emotions. No questions. Clint's voice was low, every word sharp and precise. Hayes gave him a quick, tight-lipped smile. I don't plan on making mistakes. The heavy metal door to the warehouse was unlocked. Clint pushed it open, his senses on high alert. Inside, the warehouse was even darker than the street outside. The only light came from a few dim bulbs hanging from the ceiling, casting long shadows over crates and equipment scattered around the room. A figure stepped out from the darkness, tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a black, tactical vest. The man's face was hidden beneath the shadow of his hood, but his eyes gleamed in the low light as he studied Clint and Hayes. "You Eastwood?" the man asked, his voice gravelly. Clint took a breath, his posture relaxed but ready. "I am. This is Hayes. We're here about the job." The man nodded slowly, appraising them both. "You'll do. The boss is waiting for you." Without another word, he turned and motioned for them to follow. Clint's instinct screamed at him to be cautious, but he suppressed the urge to question the man's intentions. They were being watched, and questioning too much would raise alarms. They had to play the part, just like Cole had said. As they walked deeper into the warehouse, Clint couldn't shake the sense of dread creeping up his spine. The further they went, the more it felt like a maze. No windows, no exits, just endless steel walls and machinery. Every corner seemed to hide another layer of secrecy, another level of danger. Eventually, they reached a small office at the back of the warehouse. The door opened without a knock, and they were led inside. The man who stood there was everything Clint had expected and more. His features were sharp, calculating. His eyes were cold, but there was something in his demeanor that made Clint uneasy, a quiet power, like a predator waiting for its prey to make the wrong move. This was the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to command respect. "I'm Nikolai," the man said, his voice smooth and almost too calm. "You're the new recruits, yes?" Clint nodded, trying to keep his expression neutral. "That's right. We're here to do a job. What's the assignment?" Nikolai studied them for a moment longer, then waved them toward two chairs in front of his desk. "Sit. First, let's talk about why you're here." Clint and Hayes took their seats, both of them keeping their hands on their laps, ready for whatever came next. Nikolai didn't sit down immediately. Instead, he moved around the room, inspecting the various dossiers and files on his desk before finally settling into his chair. "We have a project," Nikolai said, folding his hands in front of him. "A very important project. If you're here, then you're both qualified for a specific task. But it's not just about execution. It's about trust, loyalty. We only work with people who understand that." Clint's mind raced. Nikolai's calm demeanor wasn't reassuring. It felt like a test. Everything about this man screamed control. He wasn't just some low-level player. This was one of the key people behind Operation Blackout. "What do you need from us?" Hayes asked, her voice steady, but Clint could hear the undercurrent of wariness in it. Nikolai's eyes flicked to her, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Patience and skill. We don't need people who will question orders. The job we have for you will be delicate. I need you to go in and clean up a mess that's been brewing for too long." Clint's mind was already working overtime. "Clean up a mess?" he asked, playing along. "What kind of mess?" Nikolai didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "There are leaks. Information getting into the wrong hands. People who can't be trusted. We need you to remove those problems. Quietly." The request sent a chill down Clint's spine. This wasn't just a simple mission. This was about eliminating people who were seen as expendable. But Clint knew better than to show his discomfort. He had to appear as though he belonged. "Understood," Clint said, his voice level. "Who are we targeting?" Nikolai's lips curled into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'll give you the details when the time comes. For now, consider yourselves part of the team. You'll be given a task, and once it's complete, you'll earn your place here." The weight of his words hung heavy in the room. This wasn't just about the assignment. It was about proving themselves, about gaining Nikolai's trust. And with that trust came access to the deeper layers of Operation Blackout. Clint and Hayes exchanged a brief glance, silently agreeing to keep pushing forward. They had no choice. "We'll be ready," Hayes said, her voice steady, though her eyes betrayed the tension running through her. Nikolai stood and gestured toward the door. "Good. Then I'll have the details sent to you in the morning. You'll meet your team then. For now, you're free to go. Remember, loyalty is everything. Don't forget that." As Clint and Hayes turned to leave, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The stakes were higher than they'd ever been, and the next steps they took would determine whether they succeeded or became part of the operation they were trying to destroy. The next morning came too soon. Clint couldn't shake the feeling that things were moving too quickly, as if they were being sucked into a whirlwind that would be impossible to escape. He had barely slept, his mind racing through everything Nikolai had said. It wasn't just about cleaning up a mess. It was about gaining access to the inner workings of Operation Blackout. Every mission, every job they'd be given from here on out, would bring them one step closer to the core of the conspiracy. He rubbed his eyes as he pulled on his tactical gear, the weight of the day pressing on his shoulders. This wasn't going to be easy. There was no room for mistakes. If they slipped up, they were dead. Hayes was already waiting for him when he walked into their small base of operations, her eyes sharp with focus. "You ready for this?" she asked, looking up from the small laptop in front of her. Clint didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a moment to check the files Cole had given them. There were details about the target, his name, his background, his habits. He was an operative within Operation Blackout, one of the lower-tier members who had begun to leak information about the operation. It was clear why Nikolai wanted him gone. One traitor could unravel everything. "We don't have a choice," Clint said, sliding his gun into its holster. "We need to gain their trust. This guy's our first test." Hayes stood, a frown pulling at her lips. "I don't like the sound of this, Clint. Eliminating him? That's not what I signed up for." Clint locked eyes with her. He could see the doubt in her expression, but he also knew this was their only shot. "I know, Hayes, but you said it yourself. If we don't do this, everything falls apart. This is bigger than just one person." She exhaled sharply, clearly conflicted, but nodded. "I get it. Let's just get it done." The target was a man named Stephen Rowe, a mid-level operative with Operation Blackout. According to their intel, Rowe had been passing off sensitive information to an unknown party. His betrayal had been discovered, and Nikolai wanted him removed, quietly and quickly. No witnesses. No mess. Clint and Hayes drove through the city in their unmarked car, the early morning light casting long shadows across the streets. The plan was simple. Take out Rowe and make it look like a natural death. They'd be in, out, and back before anyone noticed anything was wrong. Rowe's apartment was in a nondescript building, just another beige structure on a quiet street. It looked like any other place in the city, nothing special, but Clint knew better than to let his guard down. The calmness of the environment was a trap, a mask for something much darker. They parked a block away, the car blending in with the other vehicles on the street. As they approached Rowe's building, Clint couldn't help but feel the tension rise. This was the first real test. If they failed here, everything would unravel. "You'll take the front, I'll take the back," Clint instructed, his voice low. "Make sure no one sees you. We need to be ghosts." Hayes nodded, her face a mask of concentration. They had rehearsed the plan 100 times over, but Clint could tell she was still uneasy. The killing part, that was something neither of them had signed up for. But here they were, one step away from the heart of the operation, and they couldn't afford to hesitate. Clint crept around the back of the building, his footsteps light and silent. The air was thick with anticipation, and every creak of the old wood under his boots felt like it was echoing through the stillness. He took a deep breath, focusing on the mission. His earpiece crackled to life. "I'm inside," Hayes said, her voice barely a whisper. "Target's in the living room. It's just him. You're clear." Clint moved quickly, slipping through the back door and into the hallway. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his movements were fluid and practiced. Every step, every turn. He had done this 100 times before. This time, though, felt different. This wasn't a clean extraction or a standard operation. This was a betrayal, and it had to be stopped. He reached the living room door, pausing for a moment to listen. There was no sound except for the faint hum of a TV in the background. Rowe was on the couch, oblivious to the danger closing in. Clint opened the door just a crack, his breath steady as he took in the scene. Rowe was watching a sports game, his eyes fixed on the screen. Clint had a clear shot at the back of his head, but he hesitated for just a fraction of a second. It wasn't fear. It was just the weight of what he was about to do. But there was no turning back. Rowe had to go. He pulled the trigger. The silenced shot rang out, and Rowe slumped forward, his head hitting the coffee table with a dull thud. It was over. Clint exhaled slowly, his body tense with the aftermath of the kill. He waited a moment, making sure Rowe wasn't moving. When he was certain, Clint lowered his gun and signaled to Hayes. "It's done," Clint said quietly. Clint and Hayes spent the next few minutes making sure the scene looked natural. They staged the apartment to look like a robbery gone wrong. Rowe's wallet and phone were missing. His door was slightly ajar. A quick, professional cleanup, and no one would question the death. But even as they finished the job, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. They were getting deeper into the web of Operation Blackout, and with every step, the stakes grew higher. One mistake, one slip-up, and they could end up just like Rowe. Another casualty in a game they had no chance of winning. Hayes looked at Clint as they walked back to the car, her face grim. "You think they'll believe it?" Clint didn't answer immediately. He knew that once they killed Rowe, the clock had started ticking. They were now a part of Operation Blackout, whether they liked it or not. There was no going back. "I don't know," Clint finally said, his voice low, "but I'm starting to think we might already be too far gone." Clint sat in the dimly lit room, staring at the wall across from him, lost in thought. The first kill was always the hardest, and though his body had gone through the motions, something inside him felt different now. The weight of it all, the lies, the manipulation, the corruption, was starting to sink in. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the nagging feeling of regret. Rowe's death hadn't been personal, it was business. But it didn't stop Clint from wondering what would come next. Every move they made brought them closer to Operation Blackout, closer to the dark heart of a network that had its fingers in every corner of the world. They had just taken out one pawn, but how many more would they need to eliminate before they could dismantle the whole thing? Hayes was sitting across from him, her arms crossed, her face as unreadable as ever. She hadn't said much since the mission. Clint wasn't sure if she was processing the same feelings, or if she had already compartmentalized it all, ready to move on to the next task. "Clint," she said, breaking the silence, her voice calm but laced with something deeper. "Do you ever think about what happens after this? I mean, we keep taking out pieces, but there's always more." Clint turned to face her, meeting her eyes. It wasn't a question he wanted to answer, because, truthfully, he didn't know. Every day that passed, he felt more like a pawn himself, trapped in a game that had no rules, no boundaries. But he had no choice but to keep playing. They were too far in now. "I think about it all the time," Clint replied quietly. "But right now, all we can do is keep moving forward. We don't get to ask for a way out." The next day, the phone call came. "Eastwood," a voice crackled through the earpiece. "You're needed. Nikolai wants to see you both." Clint and Hayes exchanged a glance. They'd known it was coming. Nikolai's calls were never good news, and each meeting brought them closer to something dangerous. It wasn't just about Rowe anymore. They were getting deeper into the heart of Operation Blackout, and every step forward meant new risks. But they had no choice. The car ride to the meeting location was silent. Neither of them had spoken much since Rowe's death, and the air in the vehicle was thick with anticipation. When they arrived at the warehouse where they'd first met Nikolai, Clint noticed something different. The usual atmosphere of cold professionalism was replaced by a tension that hung in the air, thick as smoke. Nikolai's office was just as stark and cold as it had been the last time. But today, it felt colder. There was a sense of urgency, an undercurrent of something that Clint couldn't quite place. "You're late." Nikolai's voice was terse as they entered. "Traffic," Clint replied without missing a beat. He wasn't about to let Nikolai rattle him. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. Nikolai looked at them both with a piercing gaze, his fingers steepled in front of him. He leaned back in his chair, a slight smirk playing at the edges of his mouth. "We've made some adjustments," he said slowly, as if savoring the moment. "You've proven yourselves, but there's a bigger task ahead. Something that requires your full attention." Clint and Hayes both remained silent, waiting for Nikolai to continue. "Operation Blackout is a delicate thing," Nikolai continued, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "We've been playing a dangerous game for years now, but the time has come to expand, to grow, to cover all our bases." His eyes flicked toward a screen on the wall that Clint hadn't noticed before. The screen flickered to life, displaying a map of the world with various red dots marking certain locations. "This is our next target," Nikolai said, pointing to a cluster of red dots in the Middle East. "We need you to go in and eliminate a key player. Someone who's been undermining our operations. His name is Elias Cater, and he's become a liability. We can't afford any more risks." Clint nodded, his mind already processing the information. Another target, another problem to solve. But this one felt different. The location was far more volatile, and the stakes were higher. The Middle East was a war zone, and going in there meant walking into the heart of enemy territory. If they were going to survive this, they had to be smart. They couldn't afford mistakes. "Understood," Clint said, meeting Nikolai's gaze. "We'll handle it." Nikolai's smirk deepened, but there was something colder in his eyes now. "I hope so, because if you fail, the consequences won't just be on you." Clint's stomach tightened. He didn't need to hear more. He could already imagine what Nikolai meant by that. Clint and Hayes spent the next few days preparing for the mission. They gathered intel, reviewed the map, and made sure they had everything they needed to survive in the hostile environment of the Middle East. They couldn't afford to rely on local support. Too many of them were likely compromised. This mission would be entirely on them. The night before their departure, Clint couldn't sleep. He lay in his cot, staring up at the ceiling, his thoughts swirling. The mission was too big, too dangerous, but they had no choice. Every move they made was one step closer to the truth behind Operation Blackout. They were getting closer to the men pulling the strings, the people who had turned their lives into this dangerous game. Hayes entered the room quietly, sitting down beside him without a word. They sat in silence for a while, neither of them needing to speak. Both of them were in the same place, too far gone to back out, too deep into the web of conspiracy to stop now. "We'll make it through this," Hayes said finally, her voice steady, but there was something in it that Clint recognized, a quiet resolve. "We always do." Clint nodded, though he wasn't so sure. But the words were comforting, and for a moment, it felt like they weren't alone in all this. "Yeah," he said softly, "we'll make it through." The following morning, Clint and Hayes boarded a private jet bound for the Middle East. The airstrip was quiet, the jet's engines a soft hum in the background, but Clint could feel the pressure building. They were heading into the unknown, where every shadow could hide an enemy and every decision could be their last. The map on the wall in the cabin still glowed, the red dots marking their destination. As the plane took off, Clint glanced out the window, watching as the city disappeared beneath them, swallowed by the horizon. He didn't know how many more missions they could survive. But one thing was certain. Once they were in, there was no way out. The jet ride was long and uncomfortable, but Clint barely noticed. He'd grown used to the discomfort, used to the feeling of being on edge. But this time, it was different. The air around him seemed thicker, like the weight of the mission was pressing down on him, suffocating him. They weren't just going to a foreign country to eliminate a target. This felt like the beginning of something bigger. Elias Cater was a player in a much larger game, and this mission wasn't just about removing him. It was about setting something in motion, something Clint wasn't sure he was ready for. Hayes sat across from him, her eyes trained on the laptop screen, reviewing the intel. She'd always been calm, cool, collected, but Clint could see the unease in her posture. They were in this together, but this mission felt like it might tear them apart. "We land in about 2 hours, Hayes said, looking up briefly. "Time to get our heads in the game." Clint nodded, his gaze drifting to the map on the wall of the plane, where the red dot marking Cater's location was flashing ominously. He couldn't shake the feeling that something would go wrong. The plane touched down in the desert airstrip, the heat radiating off the tarmac. Clint's skin prickled as he stepped off the jet and onto the dry earth. The Middle East was a different world, and the second his boots hit the ground, the air around him felt charged, hostile. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a sea of golden sand and jagged rocks. Their contact on the ground was a man named Hassan, a local who had worked with Nikolai before. His role was simple: get them to Cater's hideout and keep them alive. Clint didn't trust him, but trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. There were bigger dangers here than Hassan's loyalty. The mission was everything. If they succeeded, they'd move closer to uncovering the truth about Operation Blackout. but failure would mean death, no questions asked. Stay close, Hassan said, his tone flat and unreadable. He was dressed in traditional Middle Eastern clothing, his face obscured by a dark scarf. His eyes, though, told a different story, one Clint had seen too many times before. A man with nothing to lose. The drive to Cater's compound took over an hour. They moved through small villages, desolate roads, and broken-down buildings. The landscape was barren, as though nothing could survive in this heat, except for the men they were after. Clint's thoughts kept drifting back to Nikolai's words. There's always someone pulling the strings. There's always a bigger player. The compound appeared in the distance like a mirage, an imposing, fortified structure nestled in the middle of nowhere. Guard towers, barbed wire fences, and armed men patrolled the perimeter. This was no ordinary hideout. Cater had made sure to surround himself with layers of protection. The closer they got, the more Clint felt the tension rise in his chest. "Get ready," Hayes muttered, her eyes scanning the surroundings, her hand resting on her weapon. Clint didn't need to be told twice. He could feel the adrenaline surging, the anticipation of what was to come. This was the moment when everything could go wrong, but there was no turning back now. Hassan led them through a series of narrow paths behind the compound, staying low and hidden in the shadows. It was a risk, but Clint could tell it was their only shot. The front gates were too heavily guarded. The rear was their best chance of getting in unnoticed. But nothing was certain. One wrong move, and they'd be exposed. The compound itself was eerily quiet, but Clint knew better than to assume it was empty. The guards were likely in position, waiting for any sign of trouble. Hassan signaled for them to stop just short of the outer wall, the stone structure towering above them like a fortress. "We'll scale this wall and move inside," Hassan whispered, his hand pointing to a small gap in the barbed wire. "Keep low. Wait for my signal." Clint gave a sharp nod. He could hear the low hum of the compound's generators in the distance, the soft rustling of the desert winds. Every second felt like a lifetime. Hayes reached into her bag, pulling out a small device. It was a breaching charge, designed to silently cut through barriers without making a sound. She worked quickly, her movements precise and efficient. Clint kept his eyes trained on the wall, waiting for Hassan's signal. "Ready," Hayes whispered, her voice barely audible. Hassan gave them a brief nod, then moved forward, scaling the wall with practiced ease. Clint followed closely behind, his heart hammering in his chest. Hayes was next, her movements fluid, almost graceful. They made it to the top without incident. Clint scanned the compound below them. It was heavily guarded, but there were gaps, flaws in the security they could exploit. They dropped silently to the ground, and Hassan led them to a service door at the rear of the building. Inside the compound, the air was thick with tension. The layout was simple: long, narrow hallways, metal doors, and guards stationed at every corner. It wasn't just the men they had to worry about. It was the cameras, the security systems, the traps that could alert Cater's men to their presence at any moment. They moved quickly, silently, blending into the shadows. Every step they took felt like they were walking deeper into enemy territory. There was no room for error now. They finally reached the main building, a heavily reinforced structure in the center of the compound. Cater was inside, surrounded by his closest associates. Clint knew this wouldn't be easy, but they couldn't afford to wait. Cater had to go. If they hesitated, they'd never get another chance. Clint gave the signal, and Hayes moved first, slipping into the hallway like a shadow. She was the expert when it came to infiltration, and Clint was thankful for it. He followed closely behind, his gun ready, his mind sharp. The door to Cater's office was guarded by two men. Clint and Hayes took them out quietly, their silenced weapons making little noise. As the guards dropped, they slipped into the room. Cater was sitting behind a large desk, his back to the door. He was calm, composed, as if he knew this day would come. "You're late," Cater said, his voice low and cold. He didn't look surprised to see them. "I've been expecting you." Clint's heart skipped a beat. How did he know? Cater turned slowly in his chair, a small smile curling at the edges of his lips. "I know who you work for. I know what you're doing, but you're in way over your heads." Operation Blackout isn't just some covert mission. It's the beginning of something far bigger, something you'll never understand. Clint stepped forward, his weapon aimed at Cater's head. Enough talk. We're not here for a lecture. But Cater only smiled wider. Then I suppose it's time you find out who's really pulling the strings. Clint stood motionless, staring at Cater's lifeless body slumped across his desk. The gunshot still echoed in his ears, a dull ringing that seemed to reverberate through his chest. It was over, but the questions gnawing at him only grew louder. Hayes stood at his side, her expression unreadable, her gun still raised but aimed at the floor. They'd done what they came to do, in Cater's reign. Wipe out the one man who knew too much about Operation Blackout. But Cater's final words hadn't left Clint's mind. You're already part of the game. Had they been? Had they ever truly been free from the manipulation, from the larger forces at play? The thought settled like a stone in his stomach. He wanted to believe they could walk away from this, that their mission had been a just one, but Cater's revelations had shaken something deep within him. Hayes gave him a side-eye, her face still sharp with the focus of a soldier. We should get out of here. We've done enough damage. Clint nodded, tearing his eyes away from Cater's body. There was no time for reflection, no time for lingering doubts. The next move had already been planned. They had to go, and they had to go fast. The compound wasn't empty. Cater's men had already begun to stir, alerted by the gunfire and the growing sense that something had gone wrong. Clint had anticipated this. He'd expected chaos, and chaos was exactly what he got. He and Hayes moved swiftly through the compound, their steps sure, practiced, as they retraced their path to the back exit. Hassan, their local contact, was waiting for them at the rear gate, but Clint could see the fear in his eyes. "It's done?" Hassan asked, voice tight with uncertainty. "It's done," Clint replied, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. He didn't want to sound certain. He didn't want to believe that it was over, because the truth was, they hadn't solved anything. They had taken out one piece of a much larger puzzle, but the puzzle was still incomplete. The three of them made it to the waiting vehicle. The engine roared to life as Hassan slammed the door shut. Clint settled into the back seat, his eyes scanning the horizon, still expecting an ambush at any moment. But none came. The ride was long, tense, filled with the sound of nothing but the tires on the road. Hayes turned to him after a long silence. "What are we going to do now, Clint?" You heard him. Blackout. It's not just one man. It's a movement. A global one. Clint didn't respond immediately. He leaned back in his seat, the weight of her words settling in. Global. That wasn't just something happening on the fringes anymore. This wasn't just about bad men running countries or corporations pulling the strings. This was bigger. Much bigger. "I don't know," he finally said, "but we can't walk away from this. Not now." Hayes nodded, her jaw tight. "So, what's the plan?" Clint looked out the window, watching the barren desert stretch on. "We find out who's really behind it, who's pulling the strings. We take down Operation Blackout, every last part of it." Back at the safe house, Clint and Hayes spread out the intel they had gathered. The folder Cater had handed them sat on the table between them, the photos, names, and locations spread like a map of the enemy's inner circle. They'd barely scratched the surface. "I ran some of these names through the system," Hayes said, flipping through her tablet. "Some are clean, at least on paper. But a few." She paused, her eyes scanning the screen, as though she could already feel the weight of what she was about to say. "A few are tied to some really dark stuff. Government contracts, black ops, even private military companies. And that's just what's public." Clint leaned in, his eyes narrowing on the name at the center of the map, Oliver Carver. The name stuck out, standing in bold print next to a number of countries. Carver was a shadow, a figure who had popped up on Clint's radar before, but only in whispers. There had always been rumors about him, the kind that went beyond corruption, beyond influence. He was said to have his hand in everything from global intelligence to private security, but no one ever had enough proof to tie him to anything solid. "Carver," Clint muttered, his mind racing. "He's at the heart of it. He's the one we need." Hayes crossed her arms, her expression skeptical. "You sure about that? No one's been able to nail him down." I know, Clint replied. But Cater didn't give us much to go on. He was desperate. He had nothing left to lose. Carver's the key. If we can find him, we find out who's running Blackout. They set to work, poring over the intel, digging deeper into Carver's connections. Hours passed, and as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Clint found himself lost in the sea of documents, the names blurring together. Then, a breakthrough. Found something, Hayes said, a slight edge to her voice. She turned her tablet around, showing Clint a series of encrypted emails from Carver's private server. The emails were coded, but Hayes had a knack for cracking these things, and after some work, they were in. The contents of the messages made Clint's blood run cold. Carver wasn't just pulling strings in the shadows. He was orchestrating an entire underground network of operatives. They weren't just operating in the shadows. They were inside governments, corporations, and private sectors. Every major power player in the world seemed to be on his payroll, or at least under his influence. But the most chilling part? There was a timeline. A timeline for the Blackout, a plan to execute a worldwide takeover in the coming months. A series of key events were already in motion, designed to destabilize governments, manipulate global markets, and control the flow of information. By the time anyone figured out what was happening, it would be too late. What the hell is this? Clint whispered, feeling the enormity of it all sink in. This is bigger than we thought. We're not just fighting an operation. We're fighting a revolution. We need to stop it, Hayes said, her voice flat. And we need to do it now. Clint sat back, his fingers pressing against his temples. It was all happening too fast. They were too far in now. There was no walking away. He knew that. He had always known that. But now, the stakes had escalated beyond anything he could have imagined. This wasn't about taking down bad guys. This wasn't just a mission. This was the fight for the future. Get Nikolai on the line, Clint said, his voice low but determined. It's time we went after Carver. The atmosphere in the safe house was thick with tension as Clint and Hayes digested the explosive information about Operation Blackout. They had expected danger, corruption, and shadowy figures pulling the strings. But what they had uncovered was far worse. A full-scale global operation designed to destabilize the world and reshape it under the control of one man, Oliver Carver. Clint stared at the screen, his mind racing. Every name, every email, every connection led to the same man, Carver. He was everywhere. Governments, intelligence agencies, private corporations. The web stretched out before him like a spider's nest, and Clint had no idea how deep it went. We're dealing with something on a scale we can't even comprehend, Hayes said, her voice tight with frustration. This isn't just a few rogue actors. This is global. This could change everything. Clint didn't disagree. But he couldn't afford to panic, not now. They had one shot at this. The timeline Cater had revealed was clear. If they didn't act fast, Carver's plan could be set into motion, and they would be powerless to stop it. Get Nikolai on the line, Clint said again, his voice steady. We need to know where Carver is, and we need to know now. Nikolai's voice came through the phone, low and urgent. Clint. Hayes. What's going on? You're both off the grid. What have you found? Clint explained as quickly and concisely as possible, laying out what they had uncovered about Operation Blackout and Carver's central role. He could hear the tension in Nikolai's voice as he processed the information. Carver, Nikolai muttered, a dangerous edge creeping into his tone. I've heard whispers, but you're telling me it's worse than I thought. If he's behind this, we're looking at something far beyond what we've faced before. You're right to be concerned. Clint's jaw clenched. What do we do now? Nikolai paused for a moment, his voice changing to something more focused. You need to find him, and you need to do it fast. Blackout isn't just about destabilizing governments. It's about creating a new order. An order where Carver calls the shots. If he's in position to execute his plan, there's no telling how many lives will be lost. Clint glanced at Hayes. They both knew this was bigger than they could handle alone. We need resources. We need intel. You'll have it, Nikolai replied. I've got a team working on it. I'll send over everything I have. But you need to be careful. Carver has eyes everywhere. He's not going to make it easy for you. Hayes spoke up then, her voice steady. We're ready. We'll move out at first light. Good, Nikolai said. I'll send you the coordinates for a secure drop point. You'll get the rest of the intel there. The call ended, but Clint didn't feel any better. The weight of what they were about to face loomed large. But there was no turning back now. At dawn the next day, Clint and Hayes loaded up and headed for the drop point. Their truck rumbled down the dusty road as the sun peeked over the horizon. The silence between them was heavy, each of them lost in their own thoughts. As they neared the drop point, a small, nondescript cabin on the edge of town, Clint could feel the pressure mounting. They weren't just chasing down a lead anymore. They were going after a man who controlled the very levers of power in the world. Once we grab this intel, Clint said, breaking the silence, we go after Carver. This ends with him. Hayes glanced at him, her expression unreadable. You think we can take him down? Clint didn't answer immediately. He didn't know. But it was the only option they had. If we don't, everything we've fought for, it's all for nothing. They reached the cabin, parked the truck a short distance away, and crept toward the door. Clint signaled for Hayes to cover him as he pushed the door open slowly. Inside, a man in a black hoodie sat at a desk, his face illuminated by the glow of a computer screen. Clint Hayes, the man said, his voice calm, almost too calm. I was expecting you. Clint's hand instinctively went to his gun, but he didn't draw it. This wasn't an enemy. At least, not in the traditional sense. Who are you? Clint asked, his tone sharp. The man smiled slightly, his eyes cold. You don't know me, but I know you. Nikolai sent me. You're going to need this. He handed Clint a small flash drive, the weight of it surprisingly heavy in his hand. Clint didn't waste time. What's on it? The man leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. Everything you need to find Carver. It's not just about locating him. It's about understanding his network. Blackout is an operation within an operation. It's a puzzle with hundreds of moving pieces. But this, he gestured to the drive, this is the final piece. Clint and Hayes left the cabin without another word, the tension between them palpable. Once they were back in the truck and out of sight, Clint plugged the flash drive into his laptop. The files were vast, more than they could have anticipated. But it was the connections that hit Clint the hardest. The names of people tied to Carver's network, the covert operations scattered across the globe. The players were the same as those they'd already encountered, but now they had an even more terrifying understanding of the scope. This is, Hayes trailed off, her words failing her as she scrolled through the data. Clint rubbed his face, the weight of the information settling in. They were going to have to move quickly. Carver was smart. He wasn't going to make this easy. But the more Clint read, the more he saw the cracks in the network. The holes. The weaknesses. They weren't invincible. Not yet. There was one name that stood out among the rest. One that sent a chill down Clint's spine. Carver's lieutenant, Clint said quietly. Dr. Lena Moore. Hayes glanced up sharply. I know her. We crossed paths years ago. She's bad news. She's a mastermind behind some of the most high-level operations. If Carver's keeping her close, it's for a reason. Clint clenched his fists, his mind already running through possible scenarios. They had to get to her. If they could eliminate her, they could destabilize Carver's entire operation. We need to find her. Fast, Clint said. She's the key. The truck hit the road again, this time with a clearer goal in mind. They had a new lead, Dr. Lena Moore. The clock was ticking, and they didn't have the luxury of waiting. It was only a matter of time before Carver tightened his grip, and when that happened, it would be too late. I don't know if we'll be able to get close enough to her, Hayes said, her voice full of resolve, but also uncertainty. Clint turned to her, his expression hardening. We don't have to get close. We just have to be faster. The road ahead was uncertain, and the enemy was relentless. But for Clint, there was no turning back now. The game was on, and the stakes had never been higher. The sun was setting as Clint and Hayes drove through the quiet, narrow streets, heading for a nondescript apartment complex tucked away on the outskirts of a nearby city. The intel they had gathered pointed to Dr. Lena Moore's whereabouts. Her reputation was one of brilliance and terror, an ex-government scientist whose research on advanced weaponry and psychological manipulation had once been at the cutting edge. Now, She was a key part of Carver's global empire, and Clint knew she held the answers they desperately needed. The air between Clint and Hayes was thick with tension. Neither spoke much during the drive, both of them absorbed in their thoughts. The weight of the mission pressed down on them. Too many unanswered questions, too many dangers lurking in the shadows. "We're not going to just walk in there and grab her, Clint," Hayes finally said, breaking the silence. Her tone was practical, but there was an edge of concern. "Dr. Moore's a ghost. She's probably got half a dozen escape routes already planned, not to mention her people. Getting to her won't be easy." "I know," Clint replied, his hands tightening on the wheel. "But we don't have the luxury of time. We get in, we get the intel, and we get out." Hayes glanced at him, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "You sure about that?" Clint didn't answer immediately. He knew what she was asking. He was sure about the mission, but whether he was ready for what they might find, that was another question. Lena Moore wasn't just a scientist. She was a weapon in her own right, and Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. But there was no turning back. The apartment complex was as quiet as the rest of the city, with no signs of movement. It was an ordinary building, tucked away in the middle of an unremarkable neighborhood, the kind of place that would never attract attention. But Clint knew better. Dr. Moore had been here for months, working, planning, laying the groundwork for the next phase of Blackout. This was her base, and every instinct Clint had told him that Carver's lieutenant wouldn't be taken down easily. They parked a block away and approached on foot, weapons concealed but ready. The building looked deceptively peaceful, but Clint could feel the pulse of danger in the air. He motioned for Hayes to cover him as he moved to the side entrance. The door was unlocked, too easy. But Clint didn't trust easy. They stepped inside, moving swiftly through the dimly lit hallway, their footsteps muffled by the cheap carpeting. As they neared the door to the apartment, Clint signaled for a halt. He crouched down, checking the doorknob, then peered through the small crack in the door. He could hear muffled voices inside, though he couldn't make out the words. Someone was in there. Someone who wasn't supposed to be. "This doesn't feel right," Hayes whispered. "This is too clean." Clint raised his hand, motioning for silence. They couldn't afford to make noise. Slowly, he pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges barely audible. What they saw inside was far more than Clint had anticipated. Dr. Lena Moore was sitting at a desk in the middle of the room, her back to them. She was engrossed in a series of documents on the table, but Clint noticed immediately that something was wrong. Her body language was too still, too controlled. This wasn't the chaotic, high-stakes environment Clint had imagined. It was like she was waiting for them. Then he saw the man standing next to her, tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar running down the side of his face. A cold smirk tugged at his lips as he looked up at Clint and Hayes. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" the man said, his voice low and mocking. Clint froze, his mind racing. The door hadn't creaked when he opened it. The silence wasn't a coincidence. It was a trap. Before he could react, Lena Moore stood up from her chair, her cold blue eyes locking onto his. She was younger than he had expected, probably in her late 30s, but the calm, calculating look in her eyes betrayed her experience. She had known they were coming. "You really shouldn't have come here," Moore said, her voice smooth, almost serene. Clint's pulse quickened. He wasn't sure how she'd known, but it didn't matter now. They were in the lion's den. "Lena Moore," Clint said, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "You're part of this. You're the key to everything Carver's building." Moore smiled faintly, crossing her arms as she took a step toward him. "You have no idea what you're up against. You think Carver's the problem? He's not. He's only a part of the larger equation. But you wouldn't understand. You're too small. You don't see the bigger picture." Clint narrowed his eyes. "Then help me understand. What is Blackout? What is Carver trying to do?" She tilted her head slightly, like a predator toying with its prey. "You're playing checkers when everyone else is playing chess. Blackout isn't just about taking down governments or systems. It's about control. It's about reshaping the world into something better. Carver's not the one you should be worried about. You should be worried about the others, the ones pulling his strings." Before Clint could process what she had said, the man beside her moved with lightning speed. He lunged forward, knocking Clint's gun from his hand and sending him crashing against the wall. The air left Clint's lungs in a sharp gasp, but he quickly recovered, twisting his body and grabbing the first thing he could, a chair leg, and swinging it at the attacker. Hayes reacted instantly, firing a warning shot that grazed the man's shoulder. He hissed in pain but barely flinched. With a grunt, he grabbed Clint by the throat and lifted him off the ground. The world blurred around Clint's vision as he struggled to breathe. "Not fast enough, Clint," the man growled, tightening his grip. "Dr. Moore's plans are already in motion. Blackout will begin soon, and you won't be around to stop it." Hayes shot again, but this time the man deflected the bullet with a movement too fast for Clint to track. The pain in Clint's throat was unbearable, his vision going dark at the edges, but something inside him snapped. This wasn't the end. Not yet. With a burst of adrenaline, Clint kicked out, catching the man in the knee and forcing him to stagger back. He hit the ground hard, releasing Clint as he fell. Clint gasped for air, rolling to his feet. Hayes was already by his side, helping him up. "We need to get out of here," Clint wheezed, his throat still burning. Lena Moore's voice rang out, cool and calculating. "You think this is over? You think you've won? You don't even know who you're fighting." Clint steadied himself, eyes locking on hers. "I know exactly who I'm fighting, and I'm not backing down." With the sound of footsteps approaching, Clint knew their window of opportunity was closing fast. He turned to Hayes, signaling for her to cover him as he grabbed the intel from the desk. "This isn't the end," Clint said as they rushed toward the door. "We'll stop Blackout." Hayes nodded, her jaw clenched in determination. "We better. We're running out of time." They dashed out of the apartment, making their way toward the exit. The sound of gunfire rang out behind them, but they didn't stop. The danger was real, and the world they were fighting to save was slipping through their fingers. But Clint wasn't about to let it go down without a fight. The night air was cool and crisp, but Clint felt like he was suffocating. Every breath was ragged, and his mind was reeling. The encounter with Lena Moore had left him with more questions than answers. What had she meant by others? Who were these shadowy figures pulling Carver's strings? And why was she so confident that Blackout was already set into motion? As Clint and Hayes hurried down the alley, their footsteps echoing in the quiet night, the gravity of their situation settled deeper into his bones. They were up against something far bigger than they'd anticipated. Carver was just the face of it. The real threat was the network, an underground web of power brokers, mercenaries, and intelligence agencies that had already infiltrated every corner of the world. "We need to regroup," Clint said, his voice low but firm. "We need to figure out who the others are and what their endgame is." Hayes nodded, her face grim. "I don't like that we didn't get any answers from Moore. She's hiding something, but I have a bad feeling about this. The more we dig, the more dangerous it gets." Clint's hand tightened on his weapon as they reached the van parked at the end of the alley. He threw open the door, and they both jumped inside, quickly pulling away from the scene. They were moments away from being caught, and they both knew it. As they sped through the city, Clint's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, eyes narrowing as the caller ID flashed, an unlisted number. It was an encrypted call, and his gut told him it was important. "Clint Eastwood," he answered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Clint, it's Nikolai," the voice on the other end said urgently. "Listen to me. You're running out of time. Carver's plan isn't just a political takeover. It's global warfare. I have intel that confirms that Blackout is already in motion, but there's more. The people you're fighting, they're not who you think they are." Clint's grip on the wheel tightened. "What do you mean?" "There's a second layer to all of this. A deep state faction, rogue operatives within the intelligence agencies and military. Some of them are even working for foreign governments. They're the ones backing Carver, the ones orchestrating this whole mess. And now they've got the launch codes." Clint's pulse spiked. "You're telling me there are nukes involved?" "Yes," Nikolai's voice was grim. "The launch codes are being moved right now. Carver is orchestrating a global destabilization. If he has control of those codes, it's game over." Clint's stomach twisted. The stakes had just been raised. They weren't just fighting a corrupt businessman anymore. They were fighting a shadowy, well-funded cabal that had infiltrated governments, militaries, and the highest levels of intelligence. If they didn't stop Carver and these rogue elements, the world would be on the brink of nuclear war. "We need to stop this," Clint said, his voice a mixture of determination and dread. "How do we find Carver's people?" Nikolai hesitated. "I've been digging, and there's one name that keeps coming up, a man named Hector Ramirez. He's a shadow broker, an arms dealer with connections to every major player in this operation. If you find him, you'll find out who's pulling the strings. But be careful, Ramirez is a ghost. He's nearly impossible to track." Clint's mind raced. Hector Ramirez was a name he'd heard whispered in intelligence circles. A man who operated in the shadows, with no official ties to any government or organization. If Ramirez had the information they needed, he would be the key to understanding who else was involved and how they could take down the entire network. "We'll find him," Clint said. "Where is he?" Nikolai's voice dropped to a whisper. "He's in the city, but he's moving frequently. I've tracked his last known location to a small, abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. I'm sending you the coordinates now. But Clint, be careful. Ramirez doesn't take kindly to visitors." "Thanks, Nikolai," Clint said, ending the call. "Let's go find our ghost." Clint and Hayes arrived at the warehouse in less than 30 minutes. The building was a large, dilapidated structure, surrounded by high fences and shadows. It looked abandoned, but Clint knew better. This was exactly the type of place someone like Ramirez would use. No one would think to look here, and that was exactly why it was perfect for him. They parked a block away and approached on foot, their weapons ready. The area was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of gravel underfoot. Clint's instincts told him they were being watched. This wasn't going to be easy, but they didn't have the luxury of time to be subtle. "You see anything?" Hayes whispered as they crouched behind a stack of crates near the entrance. Clint surveyed the surroundings. "Nothing. But that doesn't mean anything." They moved swiftly toward the back of the warehouse, taking care to stay in the shadows. As they approached the entrance, Clint felt his heart rate quicken. The feeling of being hunted was growing stronger. He motioned for Hayes to stay low as they reached the side door. The door was slightly ajar. "Ready?" Clint whispered. Hayes nodded, her expression steely. Clint pushed the door open slowly, his senses on high alert. The inside of the warehouse was dimly lit, with only a few weak, flickering lights casting long shadows across the walls. It smelled musty, like old crates and stale air. The floor was littered with discarded shipping containers and boxes, many of them unopened. "Ramirez," Clint called, his voice cutting through the silence. "We know you're here. We're not leaving without answers." A long, tense silence followed. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged, tall, thin, with a cold, calculating stare. Hector Ramirez stepped forward, his lips curling into a dangerous smile. "I thought you'd come eventually, Clint," Ramirez said, his voice smooth and almost playful. "But you're too late." Clint didn't flinch. He had no intention of backing down. "You're the one who's too late, Ramirez. We're taking you down, and you're going to tell us everything about Carver, about the codes, about the people behind Blackout." Ramirez chuckled softly, the sound echoing through the warehouse. "You think you can stop this? You're out of your depth. The pieces are already in place, Clint. There's nothing you can do to stop it now." Before Clint could respond, a loud, metallic clang echoed through the building, followed by the hum of a dozen rifles being drawn. "Clint, look out!" Hayes shouted, drawing her own weapon as armed men in tactical gear emerged from the shadows, surrounding them in seconds. Ramirez's smirk widened as he slowly stepped back into the darkness, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You're already surrounded. There's no escape." Clint's mind raced. This was a trap, one he had walked right into. But there was no time for hesitation. If they didn't act fast, they would be captured, and any chance of stopping Blackout would be lost. "Get ready," Clint muttered, reaching for his sidearm. "This is going to get messy." The showdown had begun. The sound of footsteps echoing in the cold, cavernous space around them sent a chill down Clint's spine. It was a familiar sensation, the sense of being surrounded, of knowing that no matter how much you prepared, The enemy always had the upper hand. Ramirez was a ghost, and now Clint and Hayes were trapped in his den. The mercenaries closed in, their weapons trained on them with chilling precision. Clint's mind raced, calculating their options, but there were too many variables. The warehouse was too large, too dark, and he was too outnumbered. Hayes shifted beside him, eyes flicking to Clint. They exchanged a brief glance, one that spoke volumes. Neither of them were ready to give up, but the situation was rapidly slipping out of their control. "Clint," Hayes whispered, low enough that only he could hear. "This isn't just about Ramirez. There's someone else pulling the strings here. We've got to get out and figure out how to counter this." Clint nodded, never breaking eye contact with the nearest mercenary. There were maybe 10 of them, armed with military-grade rifles, and they had them in a perfect perimeter. Any sudden move, and it'd be over. He'd been in situations like this before. Deadly, tense situations where the wrong move could cost lives. But he wasn't backing down. "Do you really think you can stop us?" Ramirez's voice cut through the air, smooth and mocking. He stepped forward, appearing out of the shadows, his hands raised in mock surrender. "You've been running around in circles, Clint. Don't you get it? You're already too late. Blackout is already happening. The pieces are all in place." Clint kept his expression neutral, though his pulse was hammering in his chest. "You think blackout is just about taking down a few governments? I'm not buying it. What's the real play here, Ramirez? Who else is behind all of this?" Ramirez tilted his head, clearly enjoying the game. "You think you're clever, don't you? You really think you can make a difference? This isn't about governments or people. It's about control, global control. Carver was the pawn, but now, he's more useful as a distraction." The words hit Clint like a punch to the gut. Global control? They weren't just fighting a madman. This was an operation decades in the making. And it wasn't limited to just one group. It was far bigger than anything they had imagined. But before Clint could process everything, Ramirez motioned to one of his men. "Take them." In a blur of motion, Clint and Hayes dove in opposite directions as the mercenaries opened fire. Bullets ricocheted off the concrete floor, splintering crates and embedding in the walls. The air around them hummed with danger, but Clint's training kicked in immediately. He was moving before he even consciously thought about it, rolling to the side and taking cover behind a stack of boxes. Hayes was already back on her feet, drawing her sidearm and firing a quick shot at the mercenary nearest to her. The shot struck him in the shoulder, sending him stumbling back, but he was still on his feet. The mercenaries were well-trained, too well-trained for this to be easy. "Clint!" Hayes shouted, ducking behind another crate as bullets whizzed by. "We can't fight them all. We need to think our way out of this." Clint's eyes darted around the room, seeking any way out. There was no easy escape route, and they couldn't afford to take the time to fight everyone here. The odds were against them, and Ramirez was nowhere to be seen, probably already making his escape. "On my mark," Clint said, his voice low and steady. He didn't have time for second-guessing. "We make a break for the east exit." Hayes nodded. She was quick to pick up on his plan. They had to move fast. There was a narrow chance they could get out of this alive, but only if they acted in sync. Clint waited for the right moment, watching the mercenaries closely. There were 3 in the front, another 3 covering the rear, and the rest were moving toward the center of the warehouse to flank them. But Clint saw something subtle in their movements. It was the slight hesitation, the brief moment when the mercenaries were waiting for orders. "Now!" Clint shouted. He leapt out of cover, shooting at the closest mercenary in the back. The man went down in a quick, efficient movement, and Clint surged forward. Hayes was right beside him, firing shots to keep the other mercenaries at bay. They sprinted toward the east exit, dodging fire as they moved. But as they neared the door, Clint saw it. The trap. It was a set of iron bars, already beginning to descend from above, locking them in. The mercenaries had anticipated their move. They weren't getting out this way. "We're going to have to fight our way out," Clint shouted, pulling Hayes to the side just as the bars clanged into place, blocking their path. Hayes shot him a quick look, her eyes wide with realization. "You think I don't know that?" she snapped, her finger tightening on the trigger. Clint's heart was racing, but his mind was working faster. Back to the crates. We've got cover, and we can make a stand there. They scrambled back, taking cover just as the mercenaries closed in. Clint kept his breathing steady, eyes scanning every movement, looking for an opening. This wasn't a fight they could win by brute force alone. Hayes, when I say go, I need you to create a distraction, Clint said, glancing toward the stacked crates in the back corner. They were too exposed in the center of the room. You got it, she replied, her voice calm despite the chaos. Clint braced himself. He needed to buy time. They couldn't afford to be caught in the open. As the mercenaries moved closer, Clint made his move. Now, he barked. Hayes shot one of the barrels near the far wall, sending a cloud of smoke and debris flying into the air. The mercenaries flinched, momentarily blinded, and Clint used the chaos to spring into action. He darted toward the crates, pulling Hayes along with him. Down! Clint shouted as they dove behind the largest stack of crates, just as bullets sprayed past them. For a moment, the world seemed to slow down. Clint's heart pounded in his chest, and every breath felt like a struggle against the weight of the moment. He had to think fast. They couldn't afford another misstep. In the midst of the firefight, Clint's phone buzzed again. He barely heard the sound over the gunfire, but his hand shot out instinctively to grab it. It was another encrypted call, and the voice on the other end was urgent. Clint, it's Nikolai. Listen to me. They know you're coming for them. I've tracked down the location of one of their high-ranking operatives, but they're already moving. You need to act fast. Clint's pulse skipped. Where? A private airfield, about 20 miles outside the city. I don't know who's running the operation, but they've got military-grade jets ready to take off. If you can stop them there, you might be able to stop the launch codes from getting out of the country. The airfield. The last piece of the puzzle. Clint's mind was already working, his thoughts racing. We're on our way, Clint said, cutting the call before anyone could track the signal. Clint and Hayes had no choice. They had to push forward, fight their way out of the warehouse, and make a beeline for the airfield. The longer they stayed in the warehouse, the more likely it was that they'd be overwhelmed. The time for subtlety was over. They had to go all in. Clint stood up, weapon in hand, his eyes burning with determination. We're getting out of here. Now. The roar of the engine cut through the night air as Clint and Hayes raced toward the airfield, their vehicle barreling down the dark highway. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, casting long shadows of the trees lining the sides, but Clint couldn't focus on the scenery. His mind was laser-focused on the mission ahead. The intel they'd received from Nikolai had been crystal clear. If they didn't stop the military-grade jets from taking off, they might lose their only chance to prevent the global catastrophe Carver and his shadow network were trying to unleash. The launch codes, in the wrong hands, meant nuclear war, nothing less. We're getting close, Hayes said, her voice calm despite the high stakes. She glanced at the dashboard clock. Maybe 10 minutes out. Clint nodded, gripping the wheel tighter. We're not wasting time. No delays, no second guesses. We hit the ground running. Ahead of them, the lights of the airfield loomed in the distance. The silhouette of a large hangar stood against the night sky, and Clint could see several military vehicles parked in the lot. But it wasn't the vehicles that caught his attention. It was the jets. They were lined up on the tarmac, sleek and ready for takeoff. His gut told him they were not just any jets. These were state-of-the-art fighter jets, capable of carrying out an airstrike with devastating precision. The enemy was already mobilizing. As Clint turned off the main road and onto the dirt path leading toward the airfield, he could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. They had no backup, no time for subtlety. This was it. If they didn't stop the jets, there would be no turning back. They parked the van behind a row of rusted storage containers at the edge of the airfield, their breaths heavy in the cold night air. Clint grabbed his gear, checking his weapons, while Hayes did the same, her sharp eyes scanning their surroundings. The airfield was eerily quiet for its size. No patrols in sight, no sign of movement beyond the vehicles and jets. But Clint knew better than to trust the silence. "Stay low," Clint murmured, his voice steady but urgent. "We make our way to the hangar. Stay off the radar as much as possible. We need to get inside and find out who's behind this operation. Ramirez might be here." Hayes nodded, her hand gripping her pistol with an unshakable calm. They moved swiftly, crouching low to the ground, taking advantage of the shadows to stay out of sight. As they neared the hangar, Clint's pulse quickened. This was it, the final confrontation. But something was off. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into another trap. Clint motioned to Hayes to stop as they reached the side of the hangar. He peeked around the corner, surveying the area. There were a few guards milling about near the hangar doors, but nothing that seemed like an immediate threat. He counted at least 4 men, armed with rifles. Not an overwhelming number, but enough to put a serious dent in their plans. "On 3, Clint whispered. "We move fast. We take them down before they can call for backup." As soon as Clint rounded the corner to move in on the guards, he heard a faint click, the unmistakable sound of a silenced weapon being cocked. His instincts kicked in, and he ducked just as a shot rang out. The bullet whizzed past his head, hitting the concrete wall behind him. "Ambush!" Clint shouted as he dove to the side, pulling Hayes with him. It wasn't just the guards. There were more mercenaries hidden in the shadows. From every corner of the airfield, armed men began pouring out, surrounding them. Clint's mind raced. This wasn't a coincidence. They'd known they were coming. Hayes fired back, hitting one of the mercenaries in the chest, but the odds were quickly stacking against them. The mercenaries were well-coordinated, military-trained, and there were too many of them. They had to act fast. "Clint, we're not going to win this by shooting our way out," Hayes shouted, narrowly dodging a bullet. "We need to move." Clint's eyes darted around the tarmac. There had to be another way in. The hangar doors were guarded, and the airfield's perimeter was too large to circle around without being spotted. But then, Clint saw it. A small service entrance at the far end of the hangar, barely visible behind a stack of crates. It was their best chance. "Move!" Clint yelled. They dashed for the entrance, bullets ricocheting around them as they ran. Hayes was close behind, her focus unshakable, her shots precise, buying them enough time to reach cover. They reached the service entrance, Clint kicking it open with a quick shove. The sound of the gunfight outside faded as they stepped into the dark interior of the hangar. Inside, the air smelled of jet fuel and metal, and the buzzing overhead lights cast long shadows over the rows of jets parked in neat lines. The sound of the engines humming to life sent a chill through Clint's veins. He knew they didn't have much time before the jets took off, and he had to find out who was running this operation now. "Stay alert," Clint said, his voice tight with urgency. They moved quickly through the hangar, keeping to the shadows and watching for any sign of movement. The walls were lined with old tool carts, crates, and spare parts, providing some cover as they moved deeper into the belly of the building. Ahead, Clint spotted a door that led to a small office. The lights inside were on, and the sound of voices echoed through the thin walls. Clint's eyes met Hayes's, and they both nodded. "Let's go." They approached the door quietly, Clint pressing his ear to it. The voices inside were muffled, but he could make out the tone of someone speaking with authority. "What do you mean?" "We've got the launch codes. The jets are ready to deploy at dawn," one voice said, harsh and clipped. "Don't screw this up, or the whole operation is compromised." Clint's blood ran cold. The launch codes. They weren't just talking about the codes. They were preparing to use them. He motioned for Hayes to take position by the door, and then, with a swift motion, Clint pushed it open. Inside the office, Clint's eyes locked onto a man standing behind a desk. He was tall, with graying hair and a commanding presence, Hector Ramirez. But beside him stood another man Clint had never seen before, someone in a crisp, military uniform, his face sharp and calculated. This was the man pulling the strings, the mastermind behind Blackout. The man in the uniform turned as Clint and Hayes stepped into the room, his eyes narrowing in recognition. "You're too late," he said coldly. "It's already in motion." Clint's heart thudded in his chest as he raised his gun. "You're not getting away with this." The man's lips curled into a tight smile. "I think you'll find it's already too late to stop what's coming. We've waited too long. The world will bend to our will." Before Clint could respond, Ramirez spoke up, his voice smooth as always. "I don't think you quite understand, Clint. This is bigger than you, bigger than all of us. The codes are in play, and nothing you do will stop what's coming next. You've been playing checkers, while we've been playing chess." Clint's grip on his gun tightened, his mind spinning. The air was thick with tension, and for a moment, it felt like everything was about to implode. The sound of jet engines roaring to life outside only added to the urgency of the situation. The man in the uniform turned toward the window, glancing out at the tarmac. "We're ready to launch in minutes," he said, his tone icy. "And when those jets leave, your precious world will never be the same." Clint's mind raced. They were on the verge of global destruction, and Ramirez and his accomplice were about to carry out their final move. "We have to stop them," Clint muttered to Hayes. But just as he took a step forward, the door slammed shut behind them. The mercenaries had closed in. The sound of the jets revving their engines outside felt like a drumbeat in Clint's chest. Time was running out. The future of the world hung on a knife's edge, and Clint knew that one wrong move could send everything spiraling into chaos. The door behind them slammed shut, and they were surrounded. Clint's mind raced. He glanced at Hayes, who stood by his side, every muscle tense, ready to fight. They had the element of surprise once, but now they were trapped in a room with no easy exit. Ramirez stood calmly behind his desk, his expression unreadable. The man in military uniform, the true architect of this disaster, was standing near the window, his back to Clint, seemingly unfazed by their presence. But Clint wasn't fooled. He could feel the danger in the air, thick and suffocating. The clock was ticking, and they were running out of time to stop the launch. The sound of engines outside became louder, a deafening roar that shook the walls of the hangar. Every passing second brought them closer to disaster. "We're wasting time," Hayes muttered, her eyes scanning the room for any opening. "Clint, we need to make a move." Clint took a breath, his mind racing. The stakes had never been higher. "We can't just shoot our way out of this. Not with them having the launch codes. Not with those jets ready to take off." He glanced at the man by the window, his hand tightening around his weapon. The man was calm, too calm. This wasn't the first time he'd been in control of a high-stakes situation like this. He was calculating, patient, and Clint could sense that he was dangerously close to pulling off whatever plan they had set in motion. "Who are you?" Clint demanded, his voice steady despite the tension thick in the air. "What's your real goal here? Blackout is just the beginning, isn't it?" The man turned slowly, his eyes cold and calculating. He wasn't just a soldier. He was something more. "You're smarter than most, Clint Eastwood," he said, his voice smooth, almost friendly. "I'll give you that. My name is General Anton Kozlov, and this is only the beginning. We've been waiting for the right moment, the right opportunity to destabilize the global order. Blackout is just the first step in a much larger plan. Nuclear codes, world governments, they all fall in line once we send the signal." Clint's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about power. It was about complete global domination. They weren't just going to destroy governments. They were going to remake the world in their image. And the jet fighters out there? They were the vanguard of that new world, poised to strike and cripple the rest of the world's defenses. "You're insane," Clint spat, but his words were hollow. He already knew what these men were capable of. The same kind of insanity that had led to global conflicts in the past, only now, it had taken a more calculated, strategic form. "Insanity is a matter of perspective," Kozlov said, his lips curling into a thin smile. "To you, we may seem mad. To others, we will be seen as saviors, liberating the world from the chaos of its own making. And you, Clint, have been a pawn in a game you never understood. This is the new order." Clint's grip tightened around his gun, but he knew he couldn't win this battle by words alone. He needed to act fast. Time was ticking, and every second brought the jets closer to being launched. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind them. More mercenaries, this time from the back, came into view, armed and ready. The odds were stacking against them. Clint could feel his chances slipping away. "We're done talking," Clint said, voice low and sharp. "Time to end this." Before Kozlov could react, Clint and Hayes moved as one. Clint dove to the side, rolling behind a metal support beam as gunfire erupted in the room. Hayes was right behind him, her pistol firing in quick, efficient bursts that hit two of the mercenaries square in the chest. But they were outnumbered, and the mercenaries were closing in. Clint barely had time to react as a bullet grazed his arm, forcing him to roll out of the line of fire. Blood dripped from his sleeve, but he didn't feel the pain. He couldn't afford to. "Hayes!" Clint shouted. "The jets. We have to stop them before they launch." Hayes, already moving, fired another shot, taking down one of the mercenaries. She ran toward the back door, shouting over her shoulder, "I'm going for the control room. You stop Kozlov." Clint nodded, pushing himself to his feet despite the blood now trickling down his arm. His thoughts were clear. The only way to stop Kozlov and the impending launch was to take him out. The room felt like it was closing in on him. The jets outside were still roaring to life, and the air was thick with the sound of gunfire and shouting. Clint moved toward Kozlov, who was standing by the window, watching the chaos unfold. It was a strange contrast, the calm of the general and the chaos of the world he was about to unleash. Kozlov didn't even turn around as Clint closed the distance. His eyes remained fixed on the tarmac, where the jets were now taxiing, ready for takeoff. "You think you can stop this?" Kozlov's voice was calm, almost amused. "You're too late. The world is already on the brink of collapse. The pieces are in motion." Clint didn't answer. He couldn't afford to waste time with words. He lunged forward, using his body to slam into Kozlov and push him away from the window. The general staggered back, but he was fast, too fast. He reached for the weapon at his side, but Clint was already there, slamming his fist into Kozlov's jaw with a sickening thud. Kozlov grunted, but his eyes remained cold, calculating. "You can't stop it, Clint. You can only delay it." Clint wasn't listening. He delivered another punch, knocking the general to the floor. But just as he raised his gun to finish it, the lights flickered. A loud hum filled the air. The jets were moving faster now, too fast. "Hayes!" Clint shouted into his earpiece. "Where the hell are you?" "I'm almost there," Hayes replied, her voice tense. "I've got to disable the control system, but I need—" The hum grew louder, followed by a loud boom as one of the jets roared into the sky. "They're launching." Clint's heart raced. Without the control system disabled, the jets would be unstoppable. They were gone. Clint made a decision. The only way to stop this now was to take Kozlov out, and he had no time to waste. He aimed his gun at the general, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could pull the shot, a loud explosion shook the ground beneath them. The airfield quaked, and the walls of the hangar trembled as the first jet launched. But instead of feeling a sense of defeat, Clint's heart leapt. "Holy hell," he muttered. It wasn't an explosion of destruction. It was an explosion of opportunity. Through the chaos, Clint saw it. Hayes had done it. The control room was disabled, and the jets were no longer able to communicate with their command systems. The countdown had been halted, but Kozlov wasn't done. He lunged for Clint, trying to disarm him, but Clint was faster. He swung the barrel of his gun around and struck Kozlov with a brutal force, knocking him unconscious. "That's how it's done," Clint said, breathing heavily, as he stood over the fallen general. The air was thick with tension, and Clint could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a heavy, suffocating cloud. The control room was in disarray, screens blinking, alarms blaring. But in the midst of all the chaos, one thing was clear. They had won a small victory. The jets were no longer airborne, and the global launch sequence had been halted. For now, Clint stood over Kozlov, the man who had orchestrated the whole operation, his eyes scanning the unconscious figure. He wasn't sure whether to feel relief or dread. They had prevented a catastrophic launch, but the man's words echoed in his mind. "You're too late. The world is already on the brink of collapse." Clint felt the sharp pang of truth in those words. The battle for control, for power, wasn't over. If anything, it had just begun. His earpiece crackled to life. "Clint, it's Hayes. We're not out of the woods yet. Kozlov wasn't the only player in this game. We've got a bigger problem." Clint didn't respond immediately. He could hear the urgency in her voice. He'd known they were never going to be free from this until the whole network was brought down. But he needed to know what exactly they were dealing with. "What do you mean?" "The launch is stopped. We've got Kozlov. This should be over." A pause. Hayes' voice came through with a grim finality. It's never that simple, Clint. They've already activated the backup plan. There's another site, another phase to blackout. We might have stopped the jets, but they've got another weapon. One that's worse than any airstrike. Clint's stomach turned. Worse than what? He knew Hayes wasn't the kind to exaggerate. If she was saying that, it meant things had just escalated. Big time. Clint turned away from Kozlov's unconscious form, heading toward the door of the hangar. There was no time to lose. Where's the backup site? He barked, his eyes scanning the room for any more threats. Hayes' voice was steady, but Clint could hear the edge of stress in it. We've got the coordinates. It's a satellite relay station, deep in the mountains. But there's a problem. The entire site is shielded with EMP defenses. We can't get through easily. Clint's mind raced. An EMP defense system meant no electronic communications, no tracking, no way of knowing exactly what they were walking into. They were flying blind, and the clock was ticking. How much time do we have before it goes live? He asked, already preparing himself for another deadly mission. 20 minutes, Hayes replied. Clint cursed under his breath. He had no choice now. We're going in. I'm on my way to the control room to check on the satellite feeds. I'll get a clearer picture of what we're dealing with. Stay sharp, Hayes. As Clint and Hayes made their way out of the hangar, they moved quickly, their boots pounding the cold, concrete floor. The adrenaline was still coursing through Clint's veins, but his mind was already calculating the next step. They couldn't afford any mistakes now, not when the stakes were this high. How are we going to disable the EMP? Clint asked, his voice tight with focus. We're going to have to get close. Very close, Hayes said, her tone grim. I'll hack into their system manually once we're inside the perimeter. I've got some tools to bypass their shields, but it's going to take time. And we don't have much. Clint nodded, knowing what was at stake. I'll cover you. We get in. We take out anyone who stands in our way, and we shut that system down. They made their way to a black SUV parked outside the hangar, jumping in quickly and speeding toward the mountain range where the satellite station was located. The roads were slick with ice, the headlights illuminating nothing but a wall of darkness and the occasional flicker of distant lights from military outposts. Clint's grip on the steering wheel tightened, the hum of the engine a low reminder of the urgency of their mission. His thoughts drifted back to Kozlov, still unconscious in the hangar, but it was clear that the general was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Blackout was more than just a rogue operation. It was part of a larger conspiracy, one that reached farther than Clint had ever imagined. And now, he was standing on the edge of unraveling the entire thing. He'd gotten this far. He couldn't back down now. The SUV made its way up the winding mountain road, the air growing colder as they ascended. It was a good thing they had the coordinates. Without them, they would have never found this hidden satellite relay station. The ground was covered in snow, and the heavy fog swirling around them made visibility nearly impossible. This place is remote, Clint muttered, his eyes scanning the darkened landscape ahead. No way they expect anyone to find it out here. Hayes didn't reply immediately. Her eyes were locked on the radar, keeping a lookout for any signs of activity. Finally, she spoke, her voice strained. Clint, there's something you should know. Kozlov wasn't the only high-ranking official involved in this. We've got eyes on some people you know. Clint shot her a confused look. Who? People in your government. The highest levels, she said quietly. They're in on it. They've been pulling the strings behind the scenes. The only reason Blackout got this far is because they've been supporting it all along. Your own government, Clint. You're not just fighting rogue military officials. You're fighting the system itself. Clint felt his chest tighten. He couldn't believe it. He had always trusted in the system, in the people he worked for. But now, Hayes was telling him that everything he had believed in was built on a lie. How deep did this go? How far had the corruption spread? Who? Clint demanded, his voice low. Who's pulling the strings? Hayes shook her head, not answering immediately. I'll tell you everything when we're clear of this. But we can't focus on that now. Not when we're so close. Clint exhaled sharply. He had no choice but to trust her. They were about to walk into another danger zone. and it was clear that what they were facing now was much bigger than any of them had anticipated. They reached the outskirts of the facility, the satellite relay station looming in front of them like a fortress. The area was heavily fortified, the perimeter lined with razor wire and watchtowers. This was no ordinary facility. It was a military-grade installation designed to resist any attack. "We can't just walk in through the front door," Clint muttered, surveying the area. "We'll have to go in through the side entrance. Over there." He pointed toward a small gap between two large storage containers. It wasn't much, but it was their only chance. They parked the SUV behind some trees, and with their gear in hand, they made their way toward the opening. Clint could feel the tension mounting, the weight of the world hanging over them. This was the moment. If they didn't stop the backup plan, blackout would become a reality, and it would be too late for anyone to stop it. Clint and Hayes navigated the shadows, their movements swift and precise. The EMP shielding was in place, but Hayes' tools were already working to bypass the defenses. They approached the main building, where the control systems were housed. Clint signaled for Hayes to take the lead as they crept up to the entrance. "On my mark," Hayes whispered. 3, 2, 1. They moved inside, the door creaking as it opened. A series of guards patrolled the narrow hallway, but Clint and Hayes took them down quickly and quietly, their training kicking in as they moved with deadly precision. Clint felt the familiar rush of adrenaline as they made their way deeper into the facility. The sound of his own breathing filled his ears, but he knew this was it. This was the moment they either stopped the end of the world or became part of the destruction. They reached the control room in record time, Hayes immediately setting to work on the computers, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she hacked into the system. Clint stood watch, his gun drawn, his eyes darting around, ready for anything. He could feel the clock ticking down. Every second was a reminder that they were inches away from either saving or destroying everything. "Come on, Hayes," Clint muttered under his breath. The hum of the computers in the control room echoed through Clint's ears as Hayes worked furiously at the console. Sweat dripped from her forehead, her fingers moving faster than Clint had ever seen. Each keystroke seemed like it could be the one that either saved or destroyed everything. Clint was on edge, his senses heightened. The tension in the room was almost palpable. He kept his gun raised, his eyes flicking from the shadows to the entrance, waiting for someone to make a move. They were inside, but that didn't mean they were safe. The perimeter was still fortified, and the EMP shields were a major obstacle. If anyone discovered them now, they would be sitting ducks. But Clint couldn't afford to focus on that. The countdown clock was still ticking, and if Hayes didn't disable the system in time, blackout would succeed, and nothing would stop the global catastrophe. "How much longer?" Clint asked, his voice strained as he scanned the hallways through a cracked door. "Not much," Hayes muttered, her voice tight. "The system's more complicated than I thought. Whoever built this had layers upon layers of encryption, but I'm close." Clint could hear the urgency in her voice. He knew that this was their last shot. One wrong move, and the backup plan would go live, taking down satellite communication systems and shutting down entire cities, throwing the world into a blackout. And worse, if the network activated, the true purpose of blackout would unfold, destabilizing governments and causing chaos on a global scale. Clint paced back and forth, glancing at the screens, watching Hayes' progress. He could see the numbers ticking down with every second. The sense of doom was palpable, but there was nothing else to do but wait. "Clint," Hayes suddenly said, her voice low, almost a whisper, "you're not going to like this. I've bypassed most of the system, but there's one final failsafe. The backup site. It's rigged with an automatic launch mechanism. If we don't stop it in the next 5 minutes, the whole thing goes live." Clint's heart skipped a beat. 5 minutes. They were running out of time. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls pressing in on him. Every instinct screamed that they were close, but the weight of the situation was suffocating. "We don't have 5 minutes, Clint said, his voice hard. "You need to shut it down now, or blackout becomes a reality." "I'm on it," Hayes replied, her voice filled with a mixture of determination and frustration. Her hands moved even faster, almost too fast for Clint to follow. "Almost there. Just a few more seconds." Clint stepped back, eyes scanning every corner of the room. He heard a faint sound from the hallway, a click of boots on metal. His heart skipped a beat, but Hayes didn't seem to notice. "Hayes," Clint said, his voice low but firm. "We've got company." She didn't look up, still focused on the screen. "I know." Clint tensed, his hand tightening around the gun. He took a step toward the door, eyes narrowing. He wasn't going to let anything stand in the way of them finishing this. Another click of boots. Closer this time. Clint's eyes narrowed. Whoever was coming had no idea what they were walking into. The door swung open with a creak, and a group of armed soldiers stepped into the room. Clint's breath caught in his throat as they fanned out, weapons raised, eyes scanning the area. The leader of the group, a tall man with a sharp, calculating look in his eyes, stepped forward. "Looks like you two are out of time," the man said, his voice cold and confident. He wasn't surprised to see Clint. He had been expecting them. Clint's eyes flicked to Hayes, who was still typing rapidly on the console. They were close, so close. But now they had a new problem. "You're too late," the soldier said, taking another step forward. "This facility is locked down. Even if you disable the system, we've already activated the contingency. There's no stopping it now." Clint gritted his teeth. "I'm not here to talk. I'm here to stop you." Without another word, he fired. The shot rang out with a sharp crack, sending the first soldier sprawling to the floor. The others scattered, seeking cover behind nearby equipment. Clint moved quickly, diving to the side as bullets ricocheted off the walls. Hayes ducked behind the console, still working to disable the last of the system's defenses. "Clint!" she shouted. "We don't have much time." Clint fired again, taking down another soldier with a clean shot to the chest. But the others were moving faster now, coordinating their attacks. He could feel the heat of the battle intensifying. They were running out of time, and the countdown on the screen was still ticking down. The leader of the soldiers, a man with a scar running down his face, raised his weapon and aimed directly at Clint. Clint's heart pounded in his chest, his instinct screaming at him to move. But before he could react, a burst of gunfire rang out. The scarred man staggered backward, eyes wide with surprise, before dropping to the ground in a heap. Clint turned, seeing Hayes standing there, her gun still smoking in the air. She was breathing heavily, her hands still shaking from the adrenaline of the fight. But she wasn't done yet. "Hayes, finish it," Clint said, his voice low but urgent. Hayes nodded, her eyes focused as she returned to the console. "I've got it. Just a few more seconds." Clint moved to her side, covering her as the remaining soldiers advanced, determined to stop them. They weren't backing down, but neither were Clint and Hayes. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hallway, signaling reinforcements. Clint turned, firing another round into the chest of one soldier. But there were more coming, and the countdown was only getting closer. "Clint, I'm almost done," Hayes said, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "We've got 2 minutes. I'm disabling the final lock." "Good. Just hold them off for a little longer." Clint nodded, stepping forward to fire again, but his thoughts were elsewhere. They had to stop the backup plan, or it would all be for nothing. The fight felt endless, the pressure mounting. But they had come this far, and Clint wasn't about to give up now. The door to the control room was suddenly blasted open, and Clint spun around, firing instinctively. The shot hit its target, but there were still more soldiers, more threats, pouring into the room. They were getting closer, but Hayes, she was so close now. Clint moved in front of her, using his body as a shield as he fired off shot after shot. The sound of bullets cutting through the air felt like the end of the world itself, but Hayes kept typing, her eyes fixed on the final sequence. "Clint, it's done." Clint didn't hesitate. He spun around and slammed his palm against the emergency shutdown button. The room went dark. For a brief moment, everything was still. Then, the alarms fell silent, the countdown stopped, and the hum of the facility faded into nothing. Clint's breath came in heavy gasps, his body aching from the adrenaline, his mind racing to process what had just happened. They had done it. They had stopped blackout. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Clint's eyes locked onto Hayes, who looked as drained as he felt. She gave him a tight, exhausted smile. We did it. Clint nodded, but the relief was short-lived. They weren't out of the woods yet. There was still the question of how deep the conspiracy ran, who else was involved, and what the world would look like after this crisis was averted. Not yet, Clint muttered, looking around the room. We've stopped the immediate threat, but this war, it's far from over. And with that, the future of the world was once again uncertain.